Welcome back, brothers and heretics, to Warhammer. Tonight we're diving into insane theory on what if the Emperor never lied about chaos. Before we get into the madness, be sure to like and comment any videos and topics you want to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe for the Emperor. I thank you guys for the support. I've been killing it. Now, let's get into the madness.
The master of mankind sat in stillness so absolute that the silence of the imperial dungeon became a living thing around him. No machine hiss dared profane it. No servo drifted through it. No human breath touched it. Beneath the mountain roots of terror, in halls carved for empire and sealed for godless purpose, the emperor of mankind sat upon the throne of his labor and looked into the oldest wound in existence. The warp did not come to him as storm alone. It came as hunger. It came as laughter drowned in blood. It came as fevered ecstasy shrieking through velvet dark. It came as the drone of corpse flies over kingdoms of rot. It came as a whisper spoken in a scholar's voice and answered by the scream of sons torn from their courses. He saw his sons within it, 18 flames against eternity, 18 impossible lives he had drawn from gene alchemy, ambition, and theft from older powers. They burned in the Empyrean as no mortal soul could burn. They were not men. They were not gods. They were weapons given memory, pride, wrath, longing, and the shape of kings. And the things beyond the veil had fixed upon them. Horus blazed gold edged in wolfish white, ringed by spears of triumph and the shadow of a crown. Dawn stood as a bastion of iron light, unyielding and besieged on all sides. Rus was a frost firestorm, howling at red jaws in the dark. Sanguinius shone with painful beauty, a winged star bleeding over a grave without horizon. Magnus towered in cyclopean brightness, haloed by runes that twisted as they formed. The lion was a blade in forest night. Fulgrim burned in polished perfection. Perturabo glowered like a siege-world furnace. Mortarion stood in poison mists. Lorgar knelt amid scripture and fire. Curs flickered in corpse light and prophecy. Angron was a butchering sun chained to a mountain of skulls. Guilliman gleamed with measured order. Vulcan was a volcanic heart beneath black iron. Ferrus Manus blazed with forged silver wrath. Corax was a midnight wing. Jagatai Khan rode the edge of the storm, where speed itself became contempt. Alfarius was a hidden flame, reflected in 10,000 false mirrors. The warp wanted them all, not as foes alone, as prizes. The Emperor's eyes opened. The gold in them did not brighten. It hardened. He did not move. He did not need to. Thought flashed through hidden channels and silent wards. Locks older than nations unbound. Sigils flared in chamber walls. Far beyond the sanctum, through layers of adamantium, black stone, gene-sealed portals and ranks of the companions, one mind felt the summons and came at once. Malcador entered alone. The sigillite looked frail beside the architecture of the chamber. Every line of him suggested age, dust, parchment, old wisdom, and mortality preserved by ruthless purpose. Yet the pressure in the room would have slain a lesser psyker merely for stepping across the threshold, and still he came on with his staff clicking once upon the floor before. He halted and bowed his head. "My lord, rise, old friend." Malcador obeyed. He studied the Emperor's face, and what he read there made the color leave his own. "You have seen something." "I have seen confirmation." The Emperor's voice was low, utterly without strain, yet it filled the chamber like the toll of a bell cast from a mountain. "The war beneath all wars has broken concealment. The powers in the immaterium no longer circle mankind with patience. They reach now in earnest." Malcador said nothing for a moment. He knew better than to fill silence around that voice. "At last," he said. The Emperor regarded him. "Do not mistake inevitability for readiness. We are not ready. The crusade is extended to its limit already. The legions are spread across the stars. The Mechanicum is committed in full. If you mean to turn the Imperium from conquest to defense, there will be—" "I do not mean defense." That stopped him. The Emperor rose. It was not simply the act of a man standing, it was the verticality of command itself. The chamber seemed smaller for it. The golden halo of machine light and restrained psychic force cast hard edges across his armor and the eagle upon his breastplate. He looked less like a sovereign ascending from a throne than a weapon being lifted from an altar. "The Great Crusade is no longer sufficient," he said. "Compliance, annexation, expansion. These are labors of empire. What comes now is older than empire. The hand behind mutation, rebellion, false visions, spontaneous cult genesis, uncontrolled psychic manifestation, and the rot in the dreams of mankind has chosen to move openly. It seeks dominion through corruption. It seeks my sons. It seeks humanity entire." Malcador's lined face tightened. "Then you will tell them." "For once, yes." The sigillite gave a slow nod, though unease remained in him. "And how much truth will you grant?" "Enough to arm them, not enough to unmake them. You are still certain there is a distinction." "I am the distinction." Malcador held his gaze, then bowed his head once more. "What is required of me?" "A convocation, immediate, silent. Recall every primarch save none. Suspend all but essential transit secrecy. Let the order go under the pretext of a crisis in the segmentum routes. I want them on Terra. I want their principal escorts controlled, watched, and separated from all remembrancer and civilian channels. Seal the Council of Terra. Triple astropathic censorship. No word of this leaves the throne world." Malcador's mind was already moving through chains of command, fleet dispositions, embassy routes, legion pride, and the 1,000 offenses required to compel obedience from sons who commanded empires. Then he stopped. "Every primarch?" "Yes." Malcador's mouth thinned. "That will make this real to them in a way no proclamation ever could." "It is real." The Emperor turned his gaze away, toward no visible thing, and every distant battlefield at once. "Make ready the Lex Mechanics. Issue preliminary commands to Mars. Forge output is to be redirected. Colony support, civil expansion, non-essential infrastructure, ornamental works, and remembrancer patronage are to cease. I want shells, armor, engines, boarding torpedoes, Titan munitions, anti-demonic warding plates, null matrices, and psi occlusion devices." Malcador listened in gathering dread. "Psyker tithes are tripled," the Emperor continued. "Any world that protests loses its governor and gains compliance by force. Frontier populations under suspicion of cult infiltration are to be marked for purgation pending legion confirmation. Expeditionary fleets are to begin recall, not retreat, consolidation." "Whole populations?" Malcador asked carefully. "If one infested world is spared from sentiment, 1,000 worlds die of that weakness later." The sigillite closed his eyes for the span of a heartbeat. When he opened them, they were bleak and loyal. "As you command." One by one, the sons came to Terra. They came in warships whose names were already becoming legend. They came with honor guards and chosen captains, with banners stiff from vacuum and campaign dust still ground into the deck grooves of their boots. They came under sealed command, under false pretenses, under private annoyance, under curiosity, under resentment, under the instinctive tension that existed whenever the Emperor called and did not explain. Horus arrived first among them, because Horus often did. The vengeful spirit entered Terran Anchor, with its running lights hooded and its guns live. He came down in wolf grey and gold, surrounded by his Mournival, and by an ease that never quite concealed the appetite for command beneath it. Dawn came like a fortress, translated into flesh, expression carved from discipline. Russ arrived snarling at secrecy and delighted by the scent of danger. Sanguinius descended through palace light like a thing sculpted to wound the heart of every mortal who saw him. Magnus came beneath layers of warding and censure, already angered by the silence in which he had been summoned. The lion said little and watched everything. Fulgrim came radiant and immaculate, Perturabo came with cold eyes, already counting weaknesses in the walls. Mortarion brought the chill of chem fog and disdain. Lorgar came solemn, searching, almost reverent. Kurz came smiling, as though to a funeral only he understood. Angron came in chains of restraint, more ceremonial than useful, rage breathing through him like furnace heat. Guilliman came with data slates, route maps, and the habit of order worn like plate. Vulcan, Ferrus, Corax, the Khan, and Alfarius followed, each bringing his legion's weather with him. They gathered in the hall of Leng, where banners hung like captured horizons, and no remembrancer, no iterators, no mortal courtier was permitted beyond the outermost gate. Custodians stood in ranks of unmoving auramite. Malcador took his place in the half-shadow at the Emperor's right hand. The primarchs were not still. Such beings were incapable of simple stillness. Even at rest, they were force under leash. The chamber simmered with all the rivalries of the crusade. Old slights, tactical contempt, uneasy fraternity, admiration sharpened into challenge. Horus was first to speak, because he always sensed when silence had outlived its usefulness. "Father," he said, inclining his head just enough to honor without diminishing himself, "you have dragged us from the ends of the Imperium. Speak plainly. What threat warrants this?" Dawn's voice followed like a gate slamming shut. "If Terra is in peril, then the palace must be sealed and reinforced at once. I want every defensive inventory open to me." Russ bared his teeth. "Name the foe. I will know who dies first." Magnus stepped forward, red, robes and gold-ward sigils shifting with him. No more fragments, no more cautions, no more silence wrapped in necessity. If this concerns the warp, then say it before all of us. Lorgar's expression was unreadable, save for the terrible hunger in it. "There are truths in the dark, then. I knew there were. I knew you hid them." Kurz laughed. It was not mirth. It was a thin and corpse-cold sound, a blade scraping along a bone flute. "Oh, this is exquisite," he murmured. "At last, at the very edge of the blade. Say it, Father. Tell them what stalks them in their sleep. Tell them what has been licking its teeth at the walls since birth. I have seen this hall drown in futures." Angron spat on the floor. "Enough words," he growled. "Either there is war, or there is not." The Emperor rose from the throne dais. All speech died. When he spoke, even the primarchs listened as sons once more. "The warp is not merely a medium through which we pass. It is not a harmless sea disturbed only by our own reflection. It is a predatory realm inhabited by powers vast enough to shape civilizations and patient enough to poison species across epochs. Those powers have sought mankind since before the Imperium. They have whispered into madness, fed upon slaughter, fattened on plague, exalted excess, and clothed lies in prophecy." He let the words sink in like hooks driven through armor. "They know of you." That struck harder than any shouted condemnation could have struck. Even Angron's posture changed. Magnus stood utterly motionless. Lorgar's eyes widened with vindication and horror in equal measure. Sanguinius folded his wings tighter, a reflexive drawing in, as though against some foul wind. The Emperor continued. "They do not simply hate humanity. They desire it. They would make every world a shrine to appetite, every soul a coin, every victory a chain. You, my sons, are among their highest prizes. They will not approach you only with force. They will come with truth twisted into temptation, with visions, with justification, with pain answered by promise." Magnus's voice was quiet. "Then all our campaigns have been fought in ignorance." Yes. The single word was a hammer blow. Guilliman recovered first. "Then the strategic posture of the Imperium must change immediately. We are overextended. Supply lines will collapse under a mass recall unless route authority is unified and Mars brought to total war footing." "It has already begun," said the Emperor. Perturabo's lip curled. Without consultation. Without delay, said the Emperor. Vulcan stepped forward, broad as a bastion gate, his voice deep and controlled. You spoke of purgation orders, frontier worlds, populations under suspicion. There are loyal men on those worlds, workers, clans, auxiliaries. If corruption is hidden among them, we extract the sound and burn the tainted. We do not slaughter all. The Emperor turned his gaze upon him, and in that instant the chamber seemed colder. Mercy to one infested world, he said, is a death sentence laid upon 1,000 others. Vulcan did not bow. And what of those who are innocent? They are unfortunate. The words landed harder than a blow. Even Ferrus Manus frowned. Sanguinius looked down. Horus's jaw flexed once. The Emperor did not pause to soothe, because soothing was not in him now. Horus, the War Master in waiting, stepped forward instinctively before the title existed. You will take command of this war. A murmur moved through the hall like distant artillery. Not surprise, recognition, the shape of things made official. The Emperor's gaze swept the chamber. Not the war of compliance. That is ended until I decree otherwise. This is a hidden war. A war against the powers behind the veil. A war of extermination, suppression, interdiction, and annihilation. You will bind your brothers to purpose. You will make common cause where there is rivalry. You will see my will made manifest from the throne world to the marches beyond Cadia. Horus bowed his head. It should have been triumph. It was triumph. But there was something else behind his eyes now, something small and sharp and newly born. You honor me, Father. I burden you. I will carry it. I know. The hall shook. Not metaphor, not tension. Stone trembled. Vox cherubs fell silent in their alcoves. The lumen globes dimmed and flared blood red. A custodian turned his helm toward the high vaults, as though hearing something only transhuman senses could catch. Malcador's staff struck the floor. Report. A robed astropath staggered through the inner gate under custodian guard. He was blind, bleeding from nose and ears, his face blistered with psychic burn. From the Cadian marches, he gasped. Bastion chain, emergency distress, warp surge, loss of choir discipline. We are receiving. His head burst. Blood, bone splinters, and wet brain matter lashed the black floor. One of his escorts was showered in it. The corpse remained standing for a strange instant, then collapsed in a boneless heap. At the same moment, every vox grill in the hall roared alive. Screams, gunfire, prayer, static. 100 commanders shouting at once, 1,000 dying men. Malcador reached out psychically and recoiled as if struck by a furnace door thrown open. The Emperor closed his eyes for a heartbeat and saw it entire. Above the bastion worlds near Cadia, the void had split. Warp storms boiled out of nowhere, not drifting in from uncharted dark, but clawing directly into real space, as though the veil itself had been hooked and torn open by monstrous hands. Fleet pickets vanished into walls of crimson lightning. Monitors broke apart with their hulls peeled open like fruit. Astropathic choirs from one end of the sector to the other detonated in sprays of blood and liquefied thought. The worlds below, men who had stood loyal upon their walls a moment before, turned their rifles upon each other with eyes gone milk-white. Priests tore out their own tongues and praised things with no names fit for human mouths. Children split apart into masses of teeth. The sky opened in red-black wounds, and from those wounds came the first rain of demons. They fell like meteors of brass, flies, claws, silk, horn, and shrieking fire. The Emperor's eyes opened again, and all indecision in the chamber died forever. You wished for plain truth, he said. None answered. The primarchs looked upon him and understood that the age they had known had just ended. Signal every recall order. Full authority. No delay. Seal the navigators under watch. Alert Mars. Raise the Custodian Reserve. Prepare the Sisters of Silence. Muster the legions. Ready every battleship, every army host, every titan that walks, every shell that can be cast, and every blade that can hold an edge. His voice rose then, not in passion, but in majesty so cold and immense it crushed hesitation into obedience. Across Terra, across anchorages and command decks and astropathic relay chambers, across fleets waiting in high orbit and embassies not yet told they were irrelevant now, the Vox carried his words. We do not await damnation, we carry war into it. The first worlds to burn were not the lost worlds beyond the maps, nor the Xenos empires waiting in the dark between the stars. They were worlds already sworn to Terra, worlds that had raised the eagle over their capitals and paid their tithes in iron, grain, blood, and sons. Worlds that had praised the coming of the Imperium with tears in their eyes and torchlight in their streets. Worlds that now had to be butchered in the name of the same unity they had once embraced. So the war began by devouring its own reflection. Across the Cadian marches and the hard frontier beyond them, expeditionary fleets translated from the warp, under sealed order and immediate sanction. They came not as heralds, not as liberators, not as bearers of compliance and law, but as executioners. Iterators were taken from their decks and confined to silence. Remembrancers were cast from command galleries. Astropaths spoke only through screened choirs, watched by blank-eyed null maidens and custodian wardens. The words of the Emperor spread through every strategium and bridge sanctum in the same cold form. Infestation confirmed, purity indeterminate, compliance status irrelevant, annihilation if required. There were captains and governors who did not understand. There were militia lords who sent loyal declarations to the void. There were hive prefects who begged for time to prove the faithfulness of their billions. There were priests who swore the rot could be cut away. There were old men on old worlds who believed the Imperium had come to save them a second time. Then the drop pods fell. Horus led the first grand suppression from the vanguard deck of the vengeful spirit, with the calm of a monarch and the hunger of a war beast. Around him, the strategium glowed with hololithic sectors, burning fleet routes, and the pulsing crimson marks of worlds already in collapse. The officers of the Imperial Army stood in ordered rows below the command dais, their uniforms stiff with campaign dust and sleeplessness. Legion captains ringed the chamber in plate the color of old moonlight, helm lenses burning, every one of them a killer bred for the taking of cities. When Horus spoke, mortal and demigod alike listened. Read the disposition again. A Tactica officer swallowed. Primary corruption zones confirmed in the lower hive belts, Manufactorum trench districts, and Astropathic quarter. Secondary civilian disturbances across the upper transit wards. Enemy strength unknown. Population density in excess of 120 million within the capital hive alone. Horus leaned over the projection. The red light painted him like fresh blood on marble. Unknown is the refuge of cowards and clerks. Give me what the enemy can do. The officer drew breath. Mass uprising, psychic breach event, ritual concentration in the lower hive, seizure of void shield arrays if the upper levels are lost, widespread civilian conversion under panic conditions. And if they gain the lower hive body mass? The officer hesitated. Abaddon answered instead, his voice a growl like an engine starting in the dark. Then they drown the world in corpses and climb out of them. Horus nodded once. Just so. He straightened to his full height, and every eye in the chamber seemed to rise with him. The lower hive is sealed. No civilian egress, no worker columns, no refugee lanes. Lock every blast gate, collapse every freight shaft, and station army armor at all internal ascension routes. We deny them bodies, space, and motion. The upper hive is taken level by level. The ritual core is identified and broken. The breach will be collapsed by synchronized void strike the moment our spearheads reach the mark. One of the army generals, a heavy-faced veteran with old crater scars and one augmetic eye, found enough courage to speak. "My lord, there are tens of millions beneath those gates." "There are," said Horus. "They are imperial citizens." Horus looked at him, not in anger, not in pity, but with the grim finality of command that had already counted the dead and moved beyond them. "They are already coin in the enemy's hand if we do not close the fist first. This world is not saved by sentiment, General. It is saved by subtraction." No one spoke after that. Horus had that gift. He could make horror sound not merely necessary, but inevitable, as if opposition were not moral courage, but arithmetic failure. It was why men followed him. It was why his brothers measured themselves against him. It was why, when the order went out, and 40 million souls were condemned to die in darkness below the sealed hive decks, the fleets obeyed with only the soft hiss of Vox acknowledgements. Elsewhere, where wars began before armies arrived, the hidden campaign was already underway. The lion moved through the unseen arteries of the Imperium with patient wrath. His legions struck lodge cells in the dead hours before dawn. They dragged remembrancer circles from behind their velvet curtains and found beneath the poetry and wine the first crooked prayers to powers unnamed. They boarded navigator vessels without warning, broke sanctum doors with chain fists, and pulled weeping mutants from silver chambers lined with forbidden star charts and skin-bound books. On one world, a whole senate was taken alive while still assembled, every noble lord and functionary chained beneath the light of interrogation lamps, while the dark angels compared their correspondence against the records seized from a hidden archive 3 systems away. Alpharius fought. The same war without banners. Men vanished and left no trace but an empty robe, a half-erased slate, a blood fleck beneath a desk, the memory of someone who had smiled too often and listened too well. Corrupted iterators were found dead in locked cells, with their tongues cut out and scripture flensed from the inside of their cheeks. Lodge masters disappeared from councils and reappeared as butchered warnings hung from hab spires by their own ceremonial cords. Rogue psychers woke to knives in the dark and died before the first syllable of sorcery left their teeth. Rumor spread that the Imperium had begun eating its own secrets. Rumor was correct, and where secrecy failed, terror was sent in its place. Conrad Kurz descended upon a hive moon called Vanek Primus after the 8th transmission of loyalty had proven false. The governor swore fealty, while men in his underlevels flayed captives before murals painted in blood. The Night Lords came at dusk through a storm front, the color of bruised flesh. They killed the orbital batteries first. They killed the Vox towers second. They killed the noble households third, not for tactical necessity, but to teach the city the shape of its fate. When dawn crawled over the horizon, the cult magisters were hanging from the cathedral arches, with their own skins nailed above them like banners. Their screams had been magnified through the city Vox all night, long after their throats should have failed. Kurz walked the governor's palace barefoot, through blood and broken glass, his pale face lit by lumen fires and the twitching light of damaged pict screens. He dragged the governor by the jaw to a balcony overlooking the avenues where millions knelt in silence. "You wish to rule the dark," Kurz whispered, his voice soft as grave mold. "Look how obedient it has made them." Then he tore the man's head free with both hands and let the corpse tumble into the square below. The city submitted before the formal landings of the Imperial army had even begun. The stories of the Night Lords spread faster than any fleet. Entire populations purged their own hab blocks on rumor alone. Workers burned neighbors. Overseers hanged priests from cargo cranes. Innocence and guilt became irrelevant before the fear of attracting the midnight-clad sons of Nostramo. The Emperor did not rebuke Kurz. Not then. Fear was proving efficient. Efficiency had become a virtue great enough to excuse almost anything. Where the breaches burned hottest, Sanguinius was unleashed. The first sight of the Blood Angels descending into a warp rupture remained branded in the minds of every mortal survivor who saw it. They came through red cloud and ash, fall on wings of fire and jump-pack thunder, their armor gilded and blood-flecked, their blades already thirsty in their hands. Beneath them, the streets of the shrine hive had split open like old wounds. Demons poured through in shrieking masses, horned and taloned, some like emaciated. Men stretched into blasphemous lengths, others like walking heaps of fanged muscle and brass. The air stank of burned copper, opened bowels, promethium smoke, and the sweet, rotting perfume of the warp. Sanguinius landed at the center of it, like a judgment cast from heaven. His spear took the first creature through its snarling face and split spine, driving it back into the crowd behind it. His blade came free, red and smoking. He moved with a beauty so absolute, it made the slaughter around him look choreographed by a god drunk on violence. His sons followed him in perfect wrath. Chainblades screamed, bolters hammered, wings beat the smoke aside in thunderous gusts. Demon flesh burst in gobbets that hissed into vapor. Human cultists died harder. Heads vanished in wet red clouds. Rib cages opened under revving teeth. Brains painted walls in glistening fans. Entrails spilled over shrine steps and tangled around ceramite greaves. The Blood Angels advanced through it all with faces like execution masks. A mortal witness, an army colonel named Jalen Vor, watched them from the second level of a shattered Hab concourse, while his regiment bled itself dry beneath him. He had seen Astartes before. He had watched them board from parade grounds and pass through victory arches, while civilian crowds wept in gratitude. He had believed, as all men were taught to believe, that they were the Emperor's noblest sons, given flesh for war. He had not seen them at street level. Not like this. A Blood Angel hit the paving stones below his position hard enough to crack them. The legionary rose in one fluid motion and ran straight through a knot of cult militia as though their last fire were rain. He caught one man by the face and crushed the skull inside his helm grip until an eye and half a jaw sprayed from the fingers in a wet burst. Another he cut from groin to throat, chain blades spitting red froth and yellow fat. The third died when the Astartes fired his bolt pistol into the man's chest at point-blank range. Vor saw the torso open. He saw vertebrae, heart meat, pulped lung, and strips of spine slap against a wall 6 paces away. There was nothing human in the movement, nothing human in the speed, the precision, the absolute lack of hesitation. Men flinched before killing. Men checked corners with fear. Men shouted, ducked, slipped, panicked, prayed. The Astartes did none of these things. They moved like verdicts. They passed through corridors slick with blood, shell casings, brains, and boot-crushed teeth without losing balance or purpose. They killed with a silence of intent that was worse than rage. One of Vor's officers, face drenched in another man's blood, whispered, "They are saving us." Vor looked at Sanguinius, haloed by muzzle flash and demon gore, his white wings stained crimson to the bone. "No," he muttered. "They are killing what must be killed. That is not the same thing." On another world, one not yet wholly lost, Vulcan tried to prove that difference still mattered. The hive of Hespar had millions of laborers untainted in its upper manufactorums. The corruption had begun in the lower smelter crypts, where miners had uncovered a buried shrine older than human settlement, a thing of black stone and preserved malice. Cult violence spread upward, but slowly enough that extraction might still be possible. Vulcan landed with his salamanders into the furnace districts and carved corridors of survival through flame and rubble. They held transit arteries. They raised void shield pockets over refugee columns. They burned the tainted and drew the living out behind walls of heat and adamant faith. For 3 days and 3 nights, he fought to save them. He carried children in one arm and crushed possessed men with the other. He stood over broken evacuation ramps while artillery turned the horizon into molten glass. He gave water to the wounded with gauntlets still slick from killing. Every life won from the inferno seemed proof that the Emperor's hard decree could still be bent by effort, strength, and will. On the fourth day, the order came. The infestation had crossed the threshold of recoverability. Statistical projections showed exponential spread. Ritual convergence in the Underhive would produce a breach event planetary in scale within hours. Cyclonic bombardment was authorized. Full sterilization. Immediate compliance. Vulcan read the order in the command bunker, while the hab alarms screamed and the deck trembled from subterranean detonations. Around him stood his sons, soot blackened and bloody. Beyond the blast shutters waited the columns of workers he had hauled back from hell by hand. "There are still millions above the line," said one of his captains. Vulcan said nothing. He opened a Vox channel to orbit. "This is Vulcan. Delay the strike. I can still clear sectors 13 through 19. The answer did not come from an admiral. It came from the Emperor. "No." One syllable, colder than vacuum. Vulcan's eyes narrowed. "Father, there are loyal souls yet breathing on this world. There are dead worlds behind it if you fail. I do not fail. This equation is beyond valor. The world is ended. Withdraw your legion." For the first time in that war, Vulcan sounded not like a primarch, but like a son. "Must they all burn?" "Yes." The channel died. Vulcan stood motionless while the bunker shook again. Then he gave the order to withdraw. He obeyed. The obedience poisoned him more deeply than smoke or ash ever could. Lorgar, watching the campaign unfold through censored briefings, hidden testimonies, and the occasional battlefield sight he was permitted to witness, felt something in himself split open. He had craved revelation. He had wanted the great secret behind creation, the truth his father had denied, the divinity hidden under the language of reason and conquest. He had it now. Darkness was real. The powers were real. The soul had enemies vast enough to justify scripture, awe, terror, and belief. And the answer to that revelation was not worship, nor understanding, nor solemn preparation of mankind. It was silence. Burn the faithful if they have heard too much. Purge the tainted. Seal the archives. Lie to the worlds that survive. Bury the truth under policy and ash. Kill in secret so the species may go on blind. Lorgar stood in the chapel hold of his flagship among censers and scripture seals and felt sick with a grief he could not confess. The truth had come to him wearing the face of a censor and the hand of an executioner. Horus won where others endured. That was his genius. He did not merely survive disaster. He took its throat in his hand and bent it toward victory. The breach on Valtarus had spread from hive to continent, a wound in reality wide enough for whole storms of demons to spill through. Lightning of impossible colors clawed at the sky. The dead rose in spasms of puppet life where the warp mist rolled thickest. The lower hive levels, sealed by Horus's command, had become a pressure chamber of madness and butchered bodies. 40 million souls were trapped below those armored gates, starving, rioting, praying, devouring, and dying in darkness, while the thing beneath the city swelled on their terror. Horus did not look away from the cost. He used it. He drove the lunar wolves and supporting army hosts through the upper hive in a series of hammer strikes so precise that whole districts fell in hours. Assault rams punched through avenue fortresses. Reaver engines strode through hab walls. Breacher squads fought through stairwells knee-deep in blood and spent brass. Abaddon led one assault into a trade cathedral where the congregation had flensed themselves and stitched the strips of skin into hanging icons. He butchered them without a word, his blade roaring through ribs, necks, and screaming faces until the altar Steps ran slippery with red. When the ritual core was located beneath the hive spine, Horus committed himself in person. He descended through the central shaft in an armored storm, his Justarin around him like black iron wolves. The chamber below was vast enough to house a city and hot enough to cook men inside their armor. There, upon mounds of the dead, the breach gaped open like a mouth torn in the floor of the world. Demons surged from it in waves. Cult leaders stood in circles of flayed corpses, chanting through split tongues and empty eye sockets. The air itself shuddered with wrongness. Horus struck the heart. He broke the first magister with his maul and reduced the man's chest to a red crater. He took the second's head from the shoulders with a backhand blow so savage the skull shattered against a column 50 paces distant. Around him, the Justarin fired into the press, bolts detonating bodies into gobbets of meat and armor shards. The Imperial army, locked behind. Them in firing lines, poured Larsen shell into the mass until their barrels glowed. Then, Horus gave the word. From orbit, the fleet answered. The synchronized strike came down through the hive crown, through 12 kilometers of superstructure, through manufactorums, transit tunnels, worker warrens, corpse heaps, and the sealed lower levels. It reached the ritual chamber as white sunfire wrapped in void, hardened fury. For one impossible instant, everything was light. Then the breach folded inward with a scream that existed in bone more than ear. Demons were torn apart and sucked backward into nothing. Stone became vapor. The lower hive ceased to exist. The 40 million dead were denied even the dignity of corpses. Valtarus was saved. The cheers that followed across the fleet were ragged, stunned, and not entirely sane. When Horus stood again upon the strategium deck of the Vengeful Spirit, blood dried black across his armor and smoke still clinging to him, men looked upon him as something more than a general. He had done the unthinkable and called it necessity. He had turned catastrophe into victory. He had made damnation look like command. Then another fleet translated into the anchorage, its hulls scarred, its prows black with impact scoring, its holds full of slaughter. The World Eaters had returned. Their landing bays opened with the hiss of vented gore and chem smoke. Warriors in white and blue came out painted almost entirely red, helms hanging from their fists, teeth bared, chain axes nicked and clogged with half-dried flesh. Some laughed, some roared, some simply breathed like hunting beasts. Their armor stank of blood left too long in heat. At their center strode Angron. He looked magnificent and abhorrent, a giant of scars, cables, and wrath, bareheaded, his face striped with drying gore that was not wholly his own. One of his axes rested across his shoulder. It dripped as he walked. Men moved aside from him without being told. Even Astartes felt the pressure of his presence like a concussion in the soul. He saw Horus across the embarkation causeway and grinned, wide and feral. "Brother," Angron said, "you should have been there." Horus regarded the blood-soaked ranks behind him. "I can smell where you were." Angron laughed, and it was a brutal sound full of triumph and accusation both. They fought well, for cattle. Something moved in the air then. Not wind, not machine vibration, not the groan of hull metal cooling after translation. A pressure, a listening, a taste of iron on the tongue. Astropaths on the distant decks screamed in unison. One fell to his knees, clawing at his own face. Several World Eaters turned their helms toward the void at once, as if hearing drums no mortal ear could catch. Above the anchorage, beyond armor glass and shielding, the stars remained fixed and cold. Yet somewhere beyond them, in the red deeps behind the veil, something vast had heard the laughter of Angron and answered it with hunger. The world was called Gorad Rex upon imperial charts, though by the time the legions reached it, no man spoke the name without tasting ash. It had been a fortress world once, iron-crowned and trench-belted, raised to hold the marches against greenskin migrations and raider fleets out of the unlit gulfs. Its bastions had stood for generations. Its gun foundries had armed half a sector. Its planes had been cut into defensive scarworks so vast they could be seen from orbit as black geometric wounds carved through entire continents. Now those plains were gone beneath an ocean of trenches, corpse mounds, shell craters, and blood turned to mud. From the strategium tiers of the Emperor's flagship, the warfront resembled a fevered map drawn by a butcher. Brass-lit fortifications had erupted from the center of the primary continent in circles and wedges, impossible to reconcile with any sane military engineering. Trenches had become gullets. Redoubts had become altars. Entire hive annexes had collapsed inward and been remade as horned bastions grown from fused stone, steel, marrow, and compacted dead. Armies clashed around them in burning rings that thickened rather than thinned the enemy presence. Every barrage fed the storm. Every bayonet thrust fed the storm. Every chain-blade kill, every massed charge, every regiment ordered to close with the foe did not weaken the thing manifesting over Gorad Rex. It nourished it. The warp rupture above the world did not howl with subtlety like the breaches Magnus feared, or the sly poison currents that had begun to whisper through astropathic channels. It was blunt. It was animal. It was hate-made weather. Red cloud banks churned over the atmosphere in shapes that resembled flayed musculature stretched across the heavens. Thunder pealed in the rhythm of war drums. Lightning forked downward in arterial streaks, striking trenchworks and boiling men alive inside their armor. Every death was answered by a fresh surge from the breach. Every act of violence was mirrored in the sky. The first to name the patron behind it had been Magnus. The simplest of them, the Red Cyclops had said, his lone eye fixed on the projection of the warfront, voice lined with contempt and unease. The crudest, the least subtle, and because of that, perhaps the most dangerous in open war. Rage needs no philosophy. Slaughter needs no scripture. Russ had spat to one side. Then we kill its servants faster. Magnus had turned that baleful eye upon him. That is precisely the trap. The Emperor had listened to them in silence. Now he stood above the command hall upon a raised dais of auramite and dark iron, his face lit by the shifting crimson of the hololith. Around him the gathered primarchs and generals looked less like a council than an execution waiting to choose its blade. Servitors whispered data in Binharic static. Fleet officers murmured casualty returns with the deadened tones of men who had surpassed ordinary horror and arrived at numbness. Angron stood nearest the projection. He had no patience for councils. He endured them the way a caged beast endured chains, not because it accepted confinement, but because it meant to tear the bars apart at the first useful moment. The butcher's nails twitched beneath the scarred scalp ridges at his temples. Tiny spasms crossed his jaw. His gauntleted hand flexed at the haft of one axe, while the other rested point down against the deck and bit a groove through the metal beneath its weight. The central breach pulsed upon the hololith, a great red wound around which concentric assault rings had already failed 3 times. "Send me," Angron said. It was not a request. Dawn's features hardened. 3 army mass assaults have already broken against that zone. 2 Titan maniples are crippled. The enemy density at the core is beyond sane frontal pressure. Angron's lip curled. "Then stop sending sane things." Russ laughed once, humorlessly. "There speaks the hound they mean to loose." The Emperor said nothing. The silence itself made every other presence in the strategium lesser. Horus stepped nearer the projection. "There is logic in it. If any force can break the brass fortifications before the breach thickens further, it is Angron and his legion. We commit the World Eaters at the center, the Lunar Wolves on the western trench arc, the White Scars to the eastern sweep and interdiction lines. Army hosts advance under the Titans to keep the corridor open. We hit hard enough and fast enough. We may collapse the ritual geometry before it stabilizes." Russ rounded on him. "You speak as though it were merely difficult." "It is merely difficult," said Horus, "until we fail. Russ ignored that. His eyes went to the Emperor. "You mean to use him as bait?" The chamber did not breathe. The Emperor's gaze remained upon the warfront. "I mean, to use him as a weapon." Russ took a step forward, wolf pelt shifting across his shoulders like something still alive. "You heard Magnus? This thing is feeding on slaughter. It wants rage. It wants him. Loose Angron into that breach, and you may as well drive a spear into a powder cask and call it discipline." Angron bared his teeth. "Speak again, dog, and I will show you discipline with your spine in my fists." Russ did not even look at him. He is already half claimed by his own ruin. At that, Angron moved. A heartbeat, a blur of scarred muscle and armored wrath. Only the intervention of several captains and the fact that Horus set one hand upon the haft of Worldbreaker and stepped between them kept the chamber from drowning in fratricidal murder. The Emperor finally turned. The weight of his attention hit the room like a blast wave. "A blade," he said, "does not get judged for cutting too deeply when it is aimed correctly." Russ's expression darkened into something more dangerous than anger. "And if the blade splits in the hand, then the hand endures the wound." It was a monstrous answer. Russ knew it. Horus knew it. Sanguinius knew it from the way his wings drew close along his back, as if instinct sought to shield some inner hurt from words sharper than steel. Angron laughed then, and there was no mirth in it. "You hear him at last," he said, looking from Russ to the Emperor with that same naked contempt he reserved for everyone who pretended nobility still existed in war. "A blade, a hound, a thing, always a thing. Good. At least he speaks cleanly now." He lifted one axe and pointed it at the central breach. "Open me a road to those walls." The Emperor inclined his head once. So the order went out, and the war for Gorad Rex became a sacrificial geometry measured in millions. The white scars struck first, because speed was the only virtue still clean enough to call by its true name. Stormbirds and attack craft came low across the ash storms, engines howling, dropping Jagatai's suns into the eastward trench labyrinth in running spears of violence. They did not hold ground. They severed it. They burst through artillery nests, slaughtered gun crews, wrecked ammunition rails, and outran the return fury before the enemy line could close around them. Their bikes carved wakes through corpse mud. Their sabers flashed silver and red. Where static warfare had become a glutton's feast for the warp, the scars brought motion so violent it resembled mockery. Then the Titans advanced. Colonel Esteban Hale of the 19th Helican Line saw them through a haze of drifting ash and promethium smoke as his regiment moved toward the center under orders he had ceased trying to make peace with. He was a hard man by any mortal measure. He had crossed compliance campaigns on 6 worlds. He had ordered bombardments into cities and watched trench lines turn to soup around him. He had seen the blood angels at street level and learned there was a difference between salvation and extermination. None of that prepared him for Gorad Rex. The god engines emerged through the dust storm, like mountains remembering how to walk. Their void shields shimmered dull and angry in the red weather. Their carapace guns boomed with a force that struck Hale in the chest, harder than fear. Each step they took crushed the dead deeper into the earth. One warlord strode across a trench so packed with bodies that its foot sank to the ankle in a mass of shattered ribs, skulls, teeth, and steaming black slurry. Around its legs crawled swarms of infantry, tanks, and support haulers, no larger than insects by comparison. Then, the enemy artillery found the range. Macro shells fell from the blood-colored clouds and burst among the advancing army hosts. Hale saw one whole battalion vanish in a red-black concussion that blew men apart so completely there was no clean death left in them, only gobbets of lung, strips of skin, boots still containing severed feet, and helmets ringing empty as they spun through the air. Another shell struck a chimera column and turned its middle ranks into a wall of flame and flying tracks. Men ran out of the Rex with their uniforms burning, screaming until the next barrage cut them down and smeared what remained into the mud. The order to advance never changed. Ahead, the brass citadels waited. They had not been there when the campaign began. They had grown. There was no other word for it. They thrust up from the trench sea like castles forged by an insane smith, working in flesh as often as metal. Their walls gleamed with a red metallic sheen, yet sweated blood from the joins. Their parapets were lined with horned shapes, wielding axes, hooked blades, and cannons that spat chain-linked skulls, packed with explosive charge. Beneath those battlements, the trenches leading toward them had ceased to be military works and become slaughter runs, packed so tightly with dead that men sometimes fought while standing atop the chests of those killed moments before. Through all of it came the World Eaters. Angron did not descend from the heavens. He drove through the front like a shell fired from a god's own gun. Drop pods struck in a line before the principal trench network, blasting filth, limbs, and broken masonry in all directions. The pods had barely split before the World Eaters came out at a dead run, roaring through the smoke in white armor, already stained red. Chain axes revved, bolt pistols hammered. They did not seek cover. They sought contact. At their head thundered Angron. He crashed into the first trench line and tore it open by hand. One brass-armored demon met him with a cleaver the size of a vehicle hull. Angron caught the blow on one axe, drove the other through the creature's throat, then kicked its corpse so hard it exploded into shards of brass and gobbets of hell-lit meat. He vaulted the trench wall in a spray of blood and earth and landed among the next rank still killing. Men and demons alike died around him as collateral to his fury. He ripped a cult champion in half at the waist. He buried one chain axe in a horned skull and used the second to scoop another foe's lower jaw off with the tongue still attached. He did not shout battle cries. He barked accusations. "Look at this, Father." A demon came apart beneath his blows, red vapor venting from the ruin of its chest. "This is what you made useful." He drove onward, stepping on a wounded army trooper without even seeming to notice the crunch of spine beneath his boot. "You wanted a monster." Another enemy died, head and shoulders sheared away in a fan of gore. "Then spend me." The nails screamed in his skull. The warp answered. It answered not with words but with pressure, with a thickening in the air, with the rising certainty that violence itself had become liturgy, and every kill another toll of a bell only demons could hear. Sanguinius came where Angron broke. His arrival did not lessen the horror, it refined it. He descended with the blood angels into the breach corridor that the World Eaters had opened, wings throwing ash aside in pale thunder. Around him his sons landed with flawless interval, bolters already firing, blades already wet before their feet touched the ground. Where the World Eaters hacked and tore and smashed, the blood angels cut. Where Angron seemed rage-given flesh, Sanguinius was judgment given grace. Yet the end was no gentler for that beauty. Hale saw the angel from a blasted gun pit, while his regiment clawed forward in the shadow of a crippled baneblade. Sanguinius struck a pack of hound-like demons and moved through them so fast the eye could not follow the transitions, only the result. One creature lost its head and both arms in separate arcs. Another folded backward as the primarch's blade opened it from collar to groin. A third leapt for him and was caught mid-air, then torn down into the mud with the spear punched through its maw and out its spine. Blood sprayed his wings in long arterial streaks. It should have ruined the beauty of him. Instead, it made him seem made for nothing else. And there, in the steaming trench filth and the shriek of chain blades and mortal agony, Sanguinius felt it. Not a voice, not yet. A pulse, a hunger answering hunger. The battlefield was saturated in blood, in frenzy, in the red sublime of bodies opened and lives taken with righteous force. For the span of a heartbeat, Something in that ocean of slaughter brushed the floor hidden in his bloodline and recognized it. A sweetness moved through the taste of combat, dangerous as poison disguised by wine. He killed through it. He mastered it. No man watching could have guessed at the effort required. But inside, the angel recoiled from himself. "No," he whispered, as he ripped his blade free from a demon's bursting ribcage. "You will not have me." Then he drove forward harder, as though discipline could drown temptation beneath sheer momentum. On the western arc, Horus saved the line. The lunar wolves had dug in around a trench crescent, where 3 army corps were on the edge of catastrophic collapse. The enemy came over the parapets in a screaming red wave, demons and corrupted soldiery together, some with axes, some with rusting bayonets, some with only their hands and teeth, all howling as if pain itself had become sacred. The first rank of defenders broke, the second wavered. Hale heard later that one company commander shot his own men in the back to keep them facing forward. Then the reserve drop came. Horus had held back companies where lesser commanders would have spent them too early, and when the trench line reached the exact second before failure, he committed them with mathematical cruelty. Drop pods came down inside the defensive arc, not behind it, slamming into the trench network itself and pulverizing friend and foe alike. Their doors burst open into the melee, and the lunar wolves charged straight into the breach. Abaddon hit first, black with gore and dust, his blade smashing aside a demon's axe before caving its chest into wet ruin. Horus followed a moment later, like a storm front made king. Worldbreaker rose and fell. Every blow demolished something. Every order he shouted restored a fragment of coherence to the line. Third companies, left traverse, fire by rank, hold the inner lip, you there, stand it up, no backward step. If they climb, kill them in the climb. Men obeyed because the alternative was annihilation, and because Horus made obedience feel like victory already half won. The trench line stabilized. The wave broke. Bodies piled so high in the firing steps that troopers had to kick skulls and arms aside to make room for their boots. Yet even as the tactical picture improved, something more poisonous spread through the legions. They realized the truth. Every triumph at close quarters, every valorous last stand, every perfect spear thrust into the heart of a demon champion, every chain-axe duel won atop a mound of corpses did not diminish the enemy in proportion to the blood spent. The enemy thickened on it. The atmosphere itself seemed to pulse brighter red after each slaughter peak. Vox reports confirmed it from every front. Kill ratios meant less than frenzy ratios. Casualty curves were feeding manifestation curves. The war had become a sacrament to the thing they fought. Horus understood first. His face, when the data was brought to him, went utterly still. He opened a direct channel to the Emperor. "Father, the field is becoming its own engine. If we continue attritional engagement, we strengthen the breach beyond our capacity to contain it." "I know." Horus's jaw tightened. "Then we withdraw and strike from orbit." "No." Around them the war roared on. Angron's spear point had reached the inner, brass fortifications. The Titans were in too deep. The army hosts were intermingled with enemy masses across a front so vast there was no clean line left anywhere on the map. Horus looked down at the glowing tactical runes, at the minefield overlays he had not ordered, and understood before the Emperor spoke. "You mined the withdrawal routes?" The answer came without the slightest tremor of shame. "Yes." For the first time in many years, Horus felt the cold stir of true revulsion toward his father, not because the act was beyond reason. He could see the reason too clearly. Retreat would have turned the whole front into a rout, and rout was slaughter, and slaughter was worship. The Emperor had chosen to prevent retreat not out of fury, but as an act of containment. It was strategically immaculate. It was also monstrous. "You trapped them there. I fixed them in place. Tens of thousands of Astartes, millions of soldiers. Enough. Horus closed his eyes for one measured breath. When he opened them again, he was the Emperor's son once more, armored in obedience so rigid it could almost pass for faith. As you command. The final order rippled across the field in encrypted vox bursts and impossible coordination. Hold position, advance only, breach core priority absolute, orbital strike pending. The men in the trenches did not know they had been condemned. Perhaps that was mercy. More likely, it was efficiency. Angron reached the heart first. He hacked his way through the last of the brass gate guardians and stood within the inner bastion, where the ground was no longer earth, but compacted skulls mortared with blackened blood. A thing waited there, larger than any demon he had yet faced on Gorad Rex, armored in brass plates hammered through living flesh, horned, wingless, carrying an axe like a piece of a star's own wrath. It laughed when it saw him. Angron grinned back. Come then. They met with a collision that rang through the bastion walls like a forge hammer striking a planet. Around them, world-eaters, lunar wolves, blood angels, and mortal soldiers killed and died in red heaps. The last Titan maniple staggered inward through the outer works, one engine already burning from the waist down, another firing until its carapace guns fused. Above, the fleet aligned for the shot. Horus watched the firing solutions bloom. He gave the confirmation himself. Synchronized orbital fire descended. For one heartbeat, the entire warfront became light. Not flame, not shell burst, not ordinary destruction. Light so white and absolute it erased color, identity, flesh, metal, prayer, hatred, all of it alike. It punched down through the breach corridor, across the brass citadels, through the trenches packed with dead and dying, through titans, tanks, astartes, demon hosts, and the central altar geometry. The land cracked. Stone ran. Steel vaporized. Men flashed into shadows and were gone. Demons were dragged shrieking back into incandescent nothing. The very glass of the world's surface spread outward in a widening circle as sand, blood, bone, and armor became a molten mirror beneath the bombardment. When the light faded, the breach was gone. So too were most of those who had stood nearest it. The field was won, at the cost of millions of Imperial soldiers reduced to ash, tens of thousands of Astartes annihilated alongside the enemy, and all but one crippled survivor of the Titan maniple. The reports flowed in by the hour, each uglier than the last. Some commanders praised the victory because they had no language left for anything else. Others said nothing at all. Horus stood in the strategium after the final confirmations had been entered, looking at the dead world below through the observation vault. His face was unreadable. That was worse than anger. The Emperor stood beside him, golden and immovable. "The field is secured," said Horus at length. "Yes. We paid in blood enough to drown lesser empires." "Yes." Horus turned slowly. "And you accept that without hesitation?" The Emperor met his gaze. "I accept what is necessary." For an instant it seemed possible Horus might speak some word that could never be recalled, some fracture born in truth rather than seduction. Instead, he bowed his head once. When he raised it again, the mask was in place. "As you will, Father." Later, in a chamber warded against every listening thing mortal craft could imagine, Magnus addressed those primarchs still present upon the flagship. He was pale by the standards of his legion, though no ordinary man would have dared name him diminished. Warp light crawled in faint sigils across his armor. Blood had dried in one corner of his mouth, where the psychic strain of the campaign had bitten inward. "You think this was revelation," he said, his voice low and heavy as old libraries burning. "It was not. It was a blow from a fist, too, blunt to scheme. A god of rage needs only corpses and fury. It is the simplest answer the Immaterium could offer us." Sanguinius stood apart in the half-dark, wings furled, eyes shadowed. Russ folded his arms. "You call that simple?" Magnus's single eye fixed upon him. Yes. No one liked the certainty in that answer. The Cyclops looked then to the astropathic charts drifting above the table, to the route lattices across which the Imperium's messages crawled, to the hidden marks only a psyker of his strength could fully read. Something else has begun to move, he said. Not in the open slaughter, in the routes between worlds, in the choirs, in the dreams of the gifted, in the minds of every legion psyker who has looked too long into the storm and thought himself unseen. Even the chamber's silence seemed to lean closer. Magnus's voice dropped to little more than a whisper. This was only the first answer. The next will be patient. By the time the fleets reached Kerra Mundi, no chart within the Imperium agreed upon what the world contained. Some records called it a dead compliance prize, a stone sphere of extinct macro-hives and abandoned academies circling a dim star at the edge of navigable certainty. Other archives, just as official and sealed with the same sigils, insisted it had never been claimed at all and remained under Xenos interdiction. Mechanicum Data Corps named it a repository world raised during forgotten old Earth wars for the storage of prescribed engines and dangerous texts. 3 astropathic summaries sent within the same hour declared it peaceful, in rebellion, and already destroyed. When the first scout frigates translated above it, they found all of those things true, and none of them sufficient. The planet turned below like an eye that had forgotten whether it looked inward or out. Its continents were arranged in geometries too clean to be natural, as if mountain ranges had once been drawn with compass and blade, then worn down by 10,000 years of neglect into shapes still almost deliberate. The principal city, a dead sprawl of towers and avenues wider than riverbeds, occupied an inland basin so vast it resembled a ritual diagram scored into the flesh of the world. At first, auspex marked streets, transit lines, hab sectors, collapsed academies and plaza works. Then the returns changed while the ships watched. Roads bent, district grids folded across one another. Towers that had stood alone now leaned in impossible clusters, like books thrust together upon a shelf. Whole neighborhoods appeared where moments before there had been only black stone courtyards. Data spirits in the survey engines began transmitting route confirmations to destinations that had not yet been entered as queries. Then the navigators started screaming, not all at once. One in a sealed sanctum aboard a cruiser at high anchor, his attendants later found flayed raw by his own hands. Then another upon a chart vessel, chanting coordinates in a dead tongue while his third eye wept blood. Then a whole relay choir broke discipline, each astropath speaking the next one's death before it occurred. Kerra Mundi was not merely tainted, it was arranged. The war there did not begin with bombardment. Conventional assault plans died in the first hour. Augur sweeps lost coherence. Vox orders returned before they were voiced. 3 companies of Imperial Army mechanized infantry marched out from their landing zone toward the Western Avenue and arrived 2 hours later at the same landing zone from the east, missing half their men and carrying ammunition boxes stamped with dates not yet reached by Terran chronometers. A battle group under Mortarian's provisional authority fired on a tower that appeared on all scopes as a hostile gun platform. The rounds passed through it without impact and struck an Allied trench line 5 kilometers beyond, killing hundreds. A data engine aboard a command. Lander birthed a string of Binharic commands in a machine voice not its own, instructing nearby armor columns to reverse into a minefield that had not existed 5 minutes earlier and existed very much by the time the lead vehicles detonated upon it. In the strategium of the Imperial flagship, Magnus watched the reports arrive with a face grown darker by the minute. "Not illusion," he said, his single eye fixed upon hololithic distortions flickering over the city map. "Not in the simple sense. The architecture is being pressured by the immaterium, meaning expectation, possibility. It is a war fought through interpretation. The city is not only shifting, it is choosing what it is according to who looks at it, and with what certainty. Russ snorted. You dress witchery in scholars' robes and call it clarity. Mortarian's lip curled. He means sorcery has infected stone. Nothing more noble than that. Magnus did not even look at them. You both despise the thing while requiring its diagnosis. How tedious. Mortarian stepped forward, armor clinking like a chain dragged through a crypt. Poison discipline still clung to him, even in the sterile light of the command hall, as if Barbarus had never left his lungs. I despise dependence on what cannot be mastered without surrender. I have seen lords who ruled by poisons no one else could breathe, by powers no common man could contest. Psychic dominion is the same filth dressed in a new language. Russ bared his teeth. I despise it because I have hunted things in the dark and learned that the mists which promise a shorter path usually hide the jaws. Magnus turned then, and the disdain in his eye was old as their brotherhood. You may both keep your philosophies. We are past the point where contempt is operational. Conventional navigation is dead within the Kepra corridors. Our ships can barely hold stable translation at the edges of the system. Ground columns are marching in circles and receiving orders from tomorrow. If you want this war fought by men rather than by confusion, you will let me map a road. Horus, standing between them, as he so often did when brotherhood became a loaded gun, spoke before either could answer. Can you do it? Magnus let the question hang. He liked being asked plain things by those capable of understanding the price of plain answers. Yes, he said at last, for a time. My legion can establish psychic waymarks through the unstable regions and pin probability hard enough to move armies through them. It will be dangerous. It will be imperfect. But without it, Kerra Mundi devours every offensive before contact is made. The Emperor had listened to the exchange in stillness. He now gave his order. The 1,000 Sons will lead route sanctification. Their usage is constrained to navigation, warding, and controlled counter-manifestation. No broad workings, no experimental penetrations, no deviation. Magnus inclined his head, but only just. As you command. Russ muttered something in Fenrisian too coarse for most mortals present to understand. Mortarian said nothing, which was its own form of disgust. So the Cyclopean War began beneath the guidance of those most mistrusted to wage it. The 1,000 Sons moved like priests through a plague of equations. They descended in ordered cohorts robed in crimson, gold warding plates burning along their armor, staffs and blades humming with restrained force. Where other legions anchored ground with trenches and armor parks, Magnus's sons anchored meaning. They drove hexagrammic pylons into broken plazas. They etched circles of containment into avenue stone, with blades hot enough to cauterize the rock. They stationed covens at major intersections and fed measured thought through linked discipline, forcing the city's malice to reveal passable lanes for minutes at a time. Around those lanes, the impossible architecture writhed. Within them, imperial columns could move. It was enough. At first, regiments passed through districts where buildings leaned inward and whispered from their windows in the voices of men long dead. Tank companies rolled under suspended arches that showed one set of carvings from the front and another from the rear, some celebrating imperial compliance, others depicting events centuries older than human settlement in impossible colors. Wounded soldiers heard their own names spoken from sewer grates just before the mortar round that would kill them landed nearby. Vox operators received commands in their own voices and froze, unsure which orders had been given and which remembered from an hour ahead. At the center of the dead city rose the Hall of Indices, a mountain-sized complex of libraries, observatories, courthouses, and civic towers fused into one impossible acropolis. It changed shape each time orbit saw it. Sometimes it was square and severe. Sometimes it spiraled like a shell. Sometimes it seemed half collapsed. But every map pointed toward it, and every corruption signature flowed from it. That was where the breach pressure concentrated. That was where the architect's hand pinched hardest at reality. Kurz loved it. He came through the war like a carrion bird gliding ahead of a storm, black-eyed and smiling at things no sane commander wished to name. Where others saw confusion, he saw pattern. He began predicting feints before the enemy lines existed. He would halt a column at a crossroads and insist the avenue ahead was false, only for the paving stones to split open moments later into a pit of teeth and madness. He would send Night Lord squads through collapsed archival stacks because he claimed the shadows there were hungrier than the ones in the plazas. They would emerge an hour later, dragging screaming cult savants and half-formed things stitched from parchment, brass wire, and human fingers. On the fourth day of the ground war, Kurz entered Horus's field command bunker without summons, streaked in rain, blood, and library dust. He leaned over the tactical table and placed one taloned finger upon a district of blank stone avenues. "Do not advance here." Horus looked at the mark. "Why?" Kurz's smile widened. "Because your dead are already walking there, and they do not care for the living treading on their route." Abaddon made a noise of contempt. Horus ignored him. "Speak plainly." Kurz turned his corpse pale face toward him. "A feint from the south will force your reserves left. The real cut comes through this avenue, not by troops, by belief. They will make the men inside it remember a battle they have not fought and break the line from within. Move your companies now or bury them later." No one liked accepting counsel from Kurz, because to do so was to admit madness sometimes saw farther than discipline. Horus moved the companies. 3 hours later, an entire army brigade on the southern front opened fire on phantoms. While they murdered empty air, a surge of warp entities and cult armor burst through the avenue Kurz had marked and smashed into the position that would have been undefended without the redeployment. Horus won the engagement, but his mouth hardened when he sent formal acknowledgement to the Night Haunter. It tasted like swallowing a blade. The deeper Imperial forces pushed, the less Kerra Mundi resembled a world, and the more it resembled a thought, trying to become a labyrinth. A full army group under Lord General Varden reached the 9th meridian under Thousand Suns' guidance and secured a chain of plazas beneath the outer shadow of the Hall of Indices. Then, the city changed around them. Avenue mouths closed where no walls had stood. Transit canyons folded over themselves. Vox traffic degraded into layered contradictions. Relief columns marched toward the trapped group and arrived at different coordinates than the ones they had departed from. Sometimes in duplicate, sometimes minus entire battalions that had no memory of where they had gone. Above the encirclement, ships at high anchor began receiving targeting returns from beneath their own decks. One destroyer opened an internal purge on itself after its machine spirit became convinced the crew were boarders from a future mutiny. Varden's men held for 2 days in a shrinking grid of stone and corpses. They fought cult infantry in magistrate robes and bronze masks. They fought automata whose limbs were made of filing cabinets, brass veins, and flensed scholars' torsos. They fought translucent things that wore the shapes of officers they trusted, giving perfect orders until the moment their faces opened vertically into lamprey mouths. Ammunition ran low. Water filters turned to blue slime. Medici syringes filled with sand. Wounded men started whispering the exact words of their own death rattles before they were mortally struck. The request to Magnus was simple: save them. The Emperor's previous command was simpler: do not go beyond constraint. Magnus stood within a ward circle in the heart of the primary command basilica, surrounded by his senior captains. Psychic maps of the city turned around him in burning tears, every route fraying, every safe corridor collapsing into paradox. He could feel the trapped army group like a dimming knot of mortal terror inside a storm made of riddles. He could also feel the shape of the thing waiting beneath the Hall of Indices, coiled not in direct hunger, like the blood god's answer on Gorad Rex, but in anticipation, in possible futures stacked one atop another, all of them smiling. Ahriman said, "The corridor will not hold. We lose them inside the hour." Another captain, blinded in one eye by previous exertions, spoke through clenched teeth. "If we widen the bridge further, we cross the limit." Magnus looked toward Terra in his mind and found only distance. Then he made the decision he had always been most suited to make and least suited to survive. "Open the 6th lattice," he said. Silence fell. "My lord," said Ahriman carefully, "the Emperor forbade." "I know what he forbade. You will tear the veil." Magnus's voice grew quiet, terrible in its certainty. "Then I will tear it in the service of my father's soldiers, rather than in obedience to my brother's fear. Open the lattice." They obeyed. The ritual was not a chant. It was a disciplined assault on uncertainty. The 1,000 suns fed their minds into linked geometry and forced the city to reveal every road it might ever contain. Sigils rose from the stone floor in columns of blue-white fire. The basilica walls shook. Blood streamed from noses and ears all around the circle. Magnus stood at its center, one eye blazing, and reached farther into the warp than any order allowed. Reality screamed. For a heartbeat, every soldier on Kerra Mundi saw the hidden city beneath the visible one. Not the dead plazas and black towers of compliance-era administration, but the sorcerous skeleton under them. Avenues made of script, gates built from equations, stairways descending into the concept of betrayal, whole districts folded from thought and rearranged by will. Then Magnus seized that impossible anatomy and wrenched. A corridor opened from the 9th meridian to the Imperial line, a road of shattering light cut through the false city by psychic force so vast it made men fall bleeding to their knees. Varden's trapped army group saw it appear before them, like a path punched through a nightmare, and staggered toward it, under covering fire from 1,000 suns and lunar wolves. They came out by the tens of thousands, many blinded, many raving, many burned raw inside their armor by energies no flesh was meant to endure. But they came out alive, and in saving them, Magnus split the wound wider. The Hall of Indices convulsed, its towers bent backward. Windows exploded outward in storms of razor glass. Every archive door within 100 kilometers slammed open at once. The widened corridor did not close behind the rescued troops. It deepened. What Magnus had dragged into visibility remained visible, and through that torn revelation, the thing beneath Kerra Mundi answered. Demons poured through, not in battalions, in cataracts, screaming avian horrors stitched from feathers, brass beaks and flames. Multi-limbed things that ran on hands and spoke in the voices of command staff. Faceless giants robed in pages torn from books not yet written. They erupted across the city all at once, because distance no longer meant what it had 5 minutes before. Machine spirits went mad instantly. A cruiser in high anchor began broadcasting hymnals in a dead Terran dialect, predating Unity by millennia, every syllable layered atop the next, until Vox crews clawed their own eardrums out. Data engines in the fleet train printed endless streams of names for men who had never been born. Gun servitors turned their weapons on the stars and fired at omens only they could see. At the center of it stood the 1,000 suns. For a few murderous minutes, it looked as if Magnus had doomed the entire campaign. Russ was already moving before the full scale of the breach resolved. He came through the command levels like a storm in ceramite, Varagir at his heels, murder plain in his face. Mortarion followed from another corridor with Death Guard veterans and a silence more hateful than any snarl. They found Magnus outside the basilica amid the roaring light of his own broken working. 1,000 suns were collapsing around him, some blind, some aflame from the inside, some still holding their staves upright through sheer discipline, while demons clawed at the widening tear above the plaza. Russ did not slow. "You did this." Magnus turned, blood running from his eye and mouth, his great frame wreathed in failing wards. "I saved them." "You fed the snare." "I saved them." Russ drew his blade. "And now I save the rest from you." The wolves surged. Bolters came up. 1,000 suns raised theirs in answer. For one appalling instant, Kerra Mundi stood upon the edge of civil war, brothers ready to murder brothers in full sight of the enemy they had come to destroy. Horus arrived in the middle of that instant. He strode between the lines with Worldbreaker in his fist, and his voice cracking through the plaza, louder than the breach itself. Enough. Even then, it nearly failed. Russ's face was murder made personal. "Move, Horus." "No. He has doomed the line. He has also saved an army group. He broke the Emperor's word." Horus stepped closer until he stood almost chest to chest with the Wolf King. "Then the Emperor will judge him. Not you. Not here. Not while the enemy is at our throat." Around them, demons shrieked from the widening tear. 1,000 suns bled onto cracked stone. Deathguard and Space Wolves glared across drawn weapons. Magnus swayed once, not from weakness alone, but from fury barely caged. Then the Emperor came. He did not descend by shuttle or escort. He arrived like sunrise forced through a keyhole. Light crashed over the plaza in a wave that turned every shadow into a shrieking thing. Demons burst where they stood, ripped apart by their own unreality. The wounded dropped to one knee from sheer pressure. Even the primarchs seemed reduced for that moment, no less mighty, but reminded with brutal clarity of the scale that stood above them. The Emperor walked to the edge of the breach and looked into it. No prayer passed his lips, no speech of comfort, no lament for the men already lost to the widening wound. He simply reached with his will toward the fleet train and seized the nearest astropathic relay chain. Hundreds of souls cried out across the void. In sanctum chambers aboard distant vessels, in shielded choir vaults and relay coffers, astropaths arched in their chairs and burned from within. Eyes burst, skin split, brains cooked in their skulls. Their deaths traveled through the psychic network as the Emperor drew them together, not as lives, but as material. He fed their extinguished minds into the breach, the way a mason would ram mortar into a crack in stone. Human souls became sealant. The tear shrank beneath their screaming annihilation. The Emperor forced more of them in, 1,000 dead, then more again. The plaza trembled. Demons caught half through the closing wound were severed into smoking halves. Lightning of impossible color flickered across the hall of indices and died. At last the breach sealed with a sound like a giant throat swallowing blood. Silence followed. Not true silence. Men still screamed in the distance. Fires still crackled. The city still shifted in hateful little motions around the edges of sight. But compared with what had come before, it felt like silence. Russ stared at the Emperor, then at Magnus, then at the breach that had been mortared shut with Imperial servants. Even he had no words for a moment. Magnus found his first. "So now you spend them openly." The Emperor turned toward him, with an expression carved from old gold and merciless purpose. "I spend what is required. You forbid me from tearing the veil, then seal it with the souls of your own choirs. I forbid you from presuming that your judgment outranks mine." Russ surged again, only Horus's gauntlet slamming into his chestplate, halting him by force. "This ends now," Horus said, every syllable like a hammer. "Not another step, not another accusation. We kill the enemy before we indulge the wound between us." Russ's nostrils flared. "One day that wound will answer itself." Magnus looked at him through blood and failing light. "One day your obedience will find it has always served the same abyss you claim to hate." Neither forgot the words. The campaign on Kerra Mundi did not end in triumph so much as exhaustion. The dead city was bombarded from orbit until its visible geometry collapsed into slag and fused stone. The Hall of Indices burned for 9 days, belching pages, ash, and blue fire into the atmosphere. Surviving cult cells were hunted through the ruins by Curs and the Lion in a partnership so efficient and joyless it unsettled even the officers who benefited from it. The Thousand Sons withdrew bloodied and diminished, carrying brothers whose eyes had been burnt white by their own primarch's disobedient salvation. Russ took his wolves back to their ships without offering apology. Mortarion spoke to no one unless command demanded it. It should have been enough suffering for one campaign. It was not. The first plague signs appeared before the fleet train cleared orbit. A water reclamation system aboard an army transport returned sweet fluid black as sump oil and crawling with pale threads that coiled like worms in the glass. 3 gene labs in the apothecarian decks of a reserve Legion carrier reported tissue bloom in supposedly sterile samples, fungal structures flowering overnight from sealed blood stores in shapes disturbingly close to laughing faces. Men woke on troop decks with fever and mud under their fingernails, despite never leaving their bunks. A quartermaster found his ammunition ledger bloated and damp, its pages fused together by a yellowish seep that stank of old graves. Then the coughing began, deep and wet and stubborn, spreading from hold to hold, with the slow certainty of something that did not need speed, because time itself was already on its side. Across the command network, medici alerts multiplied. Across the astropathic choirs, a new taste entered the signal. Not rage, not trickery, something heavier, wetter, patient, and somewhere in the lightless fold between worlds, another of the great powers smiled through rotting teeth and breathed upon the war.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support really helps.
The rot did not come as a storm. Storms at least possessed the decency of arrival. They gathered at a horizon, blackened the sky, and broke in violence visible to every eye. What followed Kerra Mundi was worse, because it behaved like certainty. It seeped into the joints of the Imperium, into the assumptions beneath readiness, into the quiet faith that war remained a thing of guns, courage, and production. Fleets did not vanish outright. They arrived late. Shell foundries did not explode. They slowed. Troopers did not always die at once. They sickened in ranks, still marching, still loading magazines, still reciting catechisms through lungs already half dissolved within their chests. Hope itself began to mildew. The main theatre of the plague campaign lay upon a forge hive complex called Oristan Tertius, a world of iron skies, processional smog, and industry on a scale fit to shame lesser planets into silence. From orbit, it had resembled a wound plated in steel. Hive spires rose from manufactorum deserts like rusted spearheads thrust up through a skin of black cloud. Trench belts scarred the outer waste in concentric continents of mud, wire, and gun emplacements. Sump oceans festered between foundry ranges and habstacks, vast inland seas of industrial runoff whose surfaces shone with every poison the Mechanicum could name, and 1,000 more it could not. Relay towers stabbed through the vapors. Reactor cathedra burned at the horizon. Billions lived there, worked there, bled there. Billions more had been delivered in chains, in troop ships, in freight elevators, in coffin-like landers, every one of them another measure of fuel for the war. By the time the Imperial Armada achieved full anchor over Oristan Tertius, the world was already drowning without ever once being submerged. The first signs had been logistical. Ammunition quotas failed to match projected burn rates. Entire munitions trains arrived packed with shells whose powder had become greasy black sludge. Water reclamation systems yielded thick brown fluid that moved in the cup before being touched. Grain stores burst with pale nodules that pulsed as though breathing. Vox traffic from the lower manufacturum belts took on a sluggish quality, as though every order crossed a swamp before reaching the listener. Then came the flesh. Workers doubled over on assembly lines, split open at the belly seam of their overalls, and spilled steaming loops of bowel infested with small, laughing mouths. Tank crews sealed inside blessed armor, drowned in their own liquefied lungs, clawing uselessly at locked hatches while the vehicles kept rolling under last command inertia. Servitors developed fevers. Skitari rusted while still alive beneath their augmetics. Regiments that had never broken under fire stood knee-deep in corpse mud and coughed chunks of their own blackened organs into rebreather masks before raising rifles to fire another volley. Nurgle's war did not ask whether men feared death. It asked how long they could continue while becoming it. Perturabo took command of the siege geometry as though the whole world had been built for his contempt. From the primary command bastion carved into the side of a Factorum mountain, he remade Oristan Tertius into numbers. Hab zones became kill corridors. Conveyor galleries became pre-ranged artillery channels. Sump bridges were either mined, collapsed, or reinforced according to how much traffic he predicted each one could bleed before failure. He stood for hours before hololithic projections the size of cathedrals, his iron face lit by shifting lines of force and attrition curves. Around him clicked the data engines of the Iron Warriors. Every return fed into new calculations. Every calculation translated into another order that would kill precisely the number of men required, and no fewer. His genius was undeniable. That was part of the ugliness. He turned one whole district of worker tenements into a layered murder grid by collapsing the upper hab stacks inward, just enough to create overlapping fields of rubble, concealed anti-armor lanes, and shell-trapped dead ground. What had been home to millions became a machine for killing plague hosts by the tens of thousands. On the southern trench arc, he ordered the pumping stations deliberately sabotaged, drowning a 400-kilometer approach in toxic slurry that bogged demon engines to their axles while preserving narrow armored lanes only his own maps could safely navigate. He converted foundry vents into flame wells and old pilgrimage boulevards into enfilade ranges. Every casualty ledger proved him correct. Every order also made it plain how much he hated being correct for others. When Horus entered the Strategium to review the eastern batteries, he found Perturabo standing before a bank of losses, his expression unchanged as columns of dead rolled upward on the slate screens. "We hold because you hold it." "Together," Horus said. Perturabo did not turn. "Do not clothe utility in praise. It insults us both." "It is not insult. It is always insult when spoken after the fact. When the wall still stands, they call it inevitable. Only when it cracks do they remember the mason." Horus let the bitterness fall where it wished. He had learned by then that some wounds inside his brothers were old enough to treat any balm as mockery. "You have the resources you asked for." "No," Perturabo said, finally looking at him. "I have the resources I forced from men who would rather spend them elsewhere. There is a difference. There always was. If Perturabo fought Oristan Tertius as a theorem written in shell bursts and ration tonnage, Mortarion fought it like a memory he despised. The plague world conditions should have belonged to him. Corpse fog, chem rain, poison winds, diseased trench belts, and death that crept instead of charging. There was something almost native in the way he moved through that hell. The Death Guard advanced beneath skies the color of infected bruises, their armor filmed with sour rain, their rebreathers hissing, their lines unbroken no matter how thick the rot grew. Mortarion himself led from the foremost contamination trenches, scythe in hand, lantern glow lancing through fog banks full of buzzing flies the size of fists. He seemed less like a general than an execution dragged from the old nightmare mists of Barbarus and given command of artillery. He hated what he was fighting because it resembled what had once ruled him. That hatred made him perfect for it. Where other commanders balked at advancing through plague marshes, carpeted in swollen dead, Mortarion simply walked into them. Where army formations broke, when the fog whispered in the voices of their decomposing comrades, the Death Guard kept pace and fired by measured volley. Mortarion personally led a breach into the rust cathedra of Hive Vask, wading through a courtyard where corpse heaps had begun to breathe and exhale fever on the living. He cut down plague bearers with short, economical swings, every motion stripped of flourish, his contempt for fear so complete that it passed into something more dangerous than courage. Yet even around him, the corruption pressed close. The greenish weeping rust that bloomed on tank tracks began appearing along the lower greaves of some Death Guard. Medici reports from their apothecaries used cautious language, but the unease was real. The warp's slow hand had begun brushing the legion best suited to endure it. Guilliman never held the center of the world. He held everything that allowed the center to exist. 500 worlds were rerouted under his authority. Grain convoys that had once fed compliant frontier belts were turned toward Oristan Tertius. Prometheum tankers vanished from 3 Crusade sectors and reappeared weeks later under ultramarine escort in the Plague War anchorage. He seized route control from admirals older than some kingdoms, rewrote tithing priorities, reassigned labor quotas, and transformed the impossible weight of imperial logistics into a weapon every bit as lethal as any Titan plasma blast. He understood what many of his brothers disdained to see. That grand strategy was not abstraction. It was ammunition arriving before dawn. It was fresh filters for rebreathers before the old ones clogged with corpse spores. It was replacement tracks for siege tanks, nutrition slurry for labor battalions, Medici kits, shell casings, reactor rods, burial crews, and the cold mathematics that decided which worlds would be stripped nearly bare so this one might continue burning long enough to matter. He stood with data slates spread around him like a second armor, listening to casualty reports from trench groups and cargo yields from distant stars in the same grave attention, because in this war, both numbers killed if mishandled. An army clerk, pale from sleeplessness and recycled air, once asked him how he managed to remember such scale without losing the human measure buried in it. Guilliman stared at the slate for a moment before answering. "You do lose it," he said. "Or rather, you divide it until it can function." The clerk did not understand. Guilliman almost envied him. On the line itself, the Plague War ceased to resemble battle and became butchery prolonged past any righteous threshold. Whole regiments continued firing while already infected beyond recovery, laser guns bucking in hands whose fingers had split and fused into blackened clubs. Men burst inside sealed void suits and painted the interior lenses with red-brown froth, while their comrades kept the firing line dressed and level. In the sump trenches north of Factorum Helos, an armored company rolled through what officers first believed was floodwater. It was liquefied dead. The slurry sucked at track assemblies and carried bloated bodies beneath the hulls, where they split and smeared into ropes of fat, skin, and bone against the undersides. Titans strode through seas of swollen corpses whose gases ignited around their feet in greasy bursts of green fire. Even the artillery became diseased. Shells landed and burst, not with clean detonation alone, but with clouds of spores, fat-biting flies, and corrosive filth that crawled under armor seals and turned men inside out over the course of a minute. Colonel Vore, who had survived the wars of blood and sorcery already, found himself once more at street level, though there was little left of streets on Oristan Tertius worth the name. He watched a platoon of auxilia hold a trench mouth while their sergeant coughed up something that looked like half a liver into the mud between volleys. The man glanced down at it, spat blood over it, and kept shouting range corrections until a mortar burst took his head off and left the body standing for one grotesque second still clenching its rifle. Vore had once feared demons for their unreality and Astartes for the inhuman certainty with which they killed. On Oristan Tertius, he discovered a deeper fear. The sight of ordinary men understanding they were already dead and continuing anyway, because the order remained. The choir sustaining the rot beneath the principal hive spire of Oristan Magna was hidden too deep for bombardment and too shielded for easy assault. It festered somewhere below the shrine districts and labor crypts, feeding plague geometry upward through chapel drains, reliquary cisterns, and manufactorum sublevels. Perturabo wanted the entire lower spire collapsed. Mortarion suggested flooding it with alchemical fire and sealing every vent. The Emperor chose another instrument. Sanguinius accepted the order in silence. He descended with the Blood Angels through maintenance shafts and ossuary stairwells into the diseased roots of the hive. Above him, Oristan Magna still retained some vestige of imperial magnificence. Processional ways, banners, balconies, steel saints, smoke-wreathed domes. Beneath it lay the truth of every hive, and the truth was filth, labor, secrecy, and the dead packed close to the machinery that fed the living. The lower he went, the less the architecture seemed built for men. Chapel sewers ran with clotted runoff and dissolved scripture. Corpse cathedrals rose in the dark, assembled from stacked laborer bodies, rendered rigid by fungus bloom and lacquered in oils that glistened like old tears. Manufactorum crypts sweated fever from their walls. Servo skulls floated in circles, chanting fragments of prayer through lungs grown from mold where no lungs should have been. Sanguinius moved through that underhell like a blade of daylight dragged into a grave. His sons slaughtered in disciplined bursts. Bolt rounds took heads apart in wet explosions that sprayed the tunnel vaults with black blood and yellow grease. Chain blades opened plague-swollen torsos and released pressure in vomiting clouds of rot. The angel himself fought with a precision that made the horror around him more obscene rather than less. He carved through bloated cult priests, split-bellied things that wore rusted censers inside their rib cages, and impaled a demon cantor upon his spear before ripping the body downward hard enough to snap its spine over his knee. Yet every burst of black ichor across his plate, every arterial sheet cast by his blade, every hot pulse of life leaving another body stirred that same hidden thirst from the earlier war. In the dark below, Oristan Magna, the floor brushed him again, not as frenzy, but as invitation. Blood in a world of disease, purity through violence, hunger disguised as righteousness. He hated it so much he became more terrible. At the bottom of the spire, he found the plague choir. It occupied an old reactor chapel vast as a city square, its floor buried beneath waist-deep corpses, fused together by rot and hymn wire. Great organ pipes of corroded brass rose into the dark, but they were no pipes. They were stacks of hollowed torsos stitched into resonance columns, each one breathing wetly through mouths held open by hooks. At their base knelt the choristers, hundreds of them, swollen nearly beyond human shape, singing with tongues black and split, while flies moved in clouds around their faces like living veils. At the center sat a priest thing upon a throne of rusted gears and vertebrae, its stomach slit wide to reveal a furnace glow of diseased warp light. Sanguinius did not speak to it. No challenge, no condemnation, no speech for history. He descended. When the Blood Angels hit the choir, the chamber became a revelation of red against green corruption. Bolter fire burst choristers into sprays of foul meat. The organ towers toppled, collapsing in avalanches of lungs, ribs, wire, and screaming half-life. Sanguinius reached the priest thing and drove his spear through its opened gut and out the back of the throne. It clawed at him with hands that shed nails like rotten petals. He tore the weapon free and beheaded it in the same motion. The song died. For one sharp instant, the whole hive seemed to inhale in shock. Then the deeper corruption answered by surging upward in all systems at once. By the time Sanguinius regained the upper war levels, Oristan Tertius was already beyond clean recovery. The Emperor knew it before anyone else. He had watched the casualty curves. He had seen the contamination spread through subcrust data channels, through sump oceans linked to cooling reservoirs, through buried transit arteries and reactor mantle shafts. The Forge world could still be held in theory. It could still produce, still anchor fleets, still serve as a bulwark, but only if one accepted that plague would remain threaded through its foundations for generations, waiting in ducts, in forgotten shrines, in sealed machine chapels. The Emperor had no patience for generations of uncertainty. He gave the order to ignite the core reactors. The command passed through the chain of hierarchy with all the cold simplicity of a verdict. Reactor cathedra below the primary hives would be overloaded in sequence. Fail-safes would be disabled. Magma vents would be opened. Continental fire would scour the lower structures, boiling the sump oceans, collapsing the underhives, and turning every sealed cavity beneath the main forge belts into a crematorium measured in tectonic plates. There were still loyal survivors below, millions of them. Evacuation projections proved impossible before detonation. Vulcan read the order and went still in a way that frightened even those who knew his great gentleness could coexist with apocalyptic violence. He had obeyed once before, and something had died in him with that obedience. Now he saw the shape of the thing clearly. This was not merely hard necessity. This was a method. Worlds were not being saved. They were being balanced. Lives were not being protected. They were being counted until the number demanded for victory had been reached. Guilliman, upon receiving the strategic annexes, understood the same truth from another angle. Administration under the Emperor was not benevolence armed for harsh times. It was the efficient measurement of sacrifice. He had always known states required burdens, and war required numbers. On Oristan Tertius, he grasped, perhaps for the first time without illusion, that his father viewed entire populations the way a master logistician viewed Promethean reserves. Precious, useful, regrettable when expended, but expendable all the same. Horus said little publicly. Privately, in the dim cold of his command chamber, while the reactor ignition sequence counted down across half the hemisphere, he asked a question aloud, with no one present to answer it. If this is victory, what in the void is damnation? The world burned anyway. Core reactors went critical beneath the hives. For a span of moments, nothing seemed to happen. Then the crust split. Fire rose from below in colossal pillars, red-white at the heart and ringed with boiling black smoke. Whole Hab districts sagged inward and vanished as their foundations liquefied. Sump oceans flashed to poison steam. Trench belts became lines of running glass. Titans, still withdrawing along the western ridges, were caught in the first eruption wave, some surviving only because their voids held long enough for them to stagger clear, with their lower limbs glowing cherry red. Loyal survivors in the underlevels never had that chance. They were baked alive in dark corridors, drowned in ash, crushed beneath the collapse, or simply erased when the earth beneath them became incandescent wrath. The plague was broken. So too was much else. When at last the fleet withdrew from the burning ruin, and the casualty books closed upon figures so obscene clerks copied them twice to ensure they were not hallucinating, a silence settled over the command, structure that no proclamation could pierce. Men obeyed still. The legions prepared for the next campaign. The Imperium remained an engine too vast to stop for grief. Yet something had changed in the spaces between brother and father, commander and command, order and meaning. Into that silence came Fulgrim's signal. It arrived under triple cipher from the far edge of the campaign routes, carried by a courier vessel so immaculate it seemed almost profane after the filth of Oristan Tertius. Horus opened the transmission with several of his brothers and watched Fulgrim's image bloom in violet and gold above the table, perfect even through distortion, his armor bright as though war itself had been edited for his convenience. Yet there was no vanity in his expression then, only sharp fascination. "I have found something," Fulgrim said. A star chart unfolded behind him. Not imperial, not human. Lines of impossible elegance curved across the projection in harmonic spirals rather than rational vectors. Symbols shone along the root cluster, like notes in a composition too exact to be accidental. A Xenos corridor, Fulgrim continued, buried inside relic architecture older than any chart we possess in this region. It resonates when approached, not by signal, by proportion, by form. The structures sing to one another across void distances in perfect interval. Perturabo frowned at once, because beauty offended him most when it implied hidden utility. Fulgrim's eyes gleamed. There is a relic cluster at the heart of it, exquisite workmanship, impossible harmonic perfection, no sign of decay, no sign of random drift. It is a road, my brothers, or the invitation to one, and if I am right, it leads not merely through space, but toward another answer from the dark. The projection glimmered in the strategium half-light, all elegant curves and silent temptation. After rust and rot, it looked almost holy. That alone made it dangerous. The corridor did not behave like a road. Roads implied distance measured in engine thrust, star position, translation error, and the tolerances of flesh forced too often through the immaterium. What Fulgrim had uncovered beyond the plague-black ruins of Oristan Tertius possessed none of that blunt utility. It was arrangement. It was cadence. It was beauty so mathematically exact that the Mechanicum adepts assigned to its first study began weeping before they understood why. Xenos pylons hung in the void around dead moons and crystal hulks, not placed in any pattern the human eye first recognized, yet once seen as a whole, they resolved into intervals, harmonic ratios, lines of form answering one another across lightless gulfs with such immaculate proportion that even hard-faced void commanders found themselves staring too long and speaking too softly, as if loud words might profane it. When the first Imperial warships crossed the threshold of that route, their hulls began to sing, not by speaker, not by damage, not by atmospheric friction impossible in the void, but by resonance. Armor plates thrummed with tones so pure they sank beneath hearing and stirred the teeth, the blood, the secret longings men kept even from themselves. Deck crews reported colors brightening where no lumen levels had changed. Astropaths grew feverish and smiled at nothing. One navigator, sealed in his sanctum, whispered for 3 hours about a city waiting beneath a sky made from polished pearl. Fulgrim stood upon the command deck of the Pride of the Emperor and looked out through the great armored glass into the curve of impossible stars. The root lights reflected across his plate and made him seem forged from some finer metal than any his brothers wore. His face, beautiful enough to anger sober men, carried something fiercer than vanity now. Recognition, desire. Not the crude desire of flesh, but the higher and more dangerous urge to meet perfection and prove oneself equal to it. "You, feel it," he said without turning. Ferrus Manus stood beside him like a threat given iron shape. The silver of his metal hands caught the same unclean harmonics and reflected them coldly. Where Fulgrim seemed illuminated by the corridor, Ferrus seemed to reject it by mere presence. "I feel a snare," Ferrus said. Fulgrim laughed softly. "You always mistake refinement for weakness, and you always mistake danger for invitation." That might have become sharper, but it did not. Not yet. There was still brotherhood between them, still the old alloy of rivalry and respect that had once made them stronger together than apart. The Emperor had paired them for precisely that reason. Fulgrim would go where ordinary warriors recoiled, because his soul leaned naturally toward mastery, toward excellence, toward the irresistible challenge of perfect form. Ferrus would stand beside him as weight, as blunt truth, as the brother least likely to mistake seduction for revelation. Between them, the spear point of the assault might remain a weapon rather than a vanity. Or so the Emperor judged. The world at the end of the corridor had no name in any human archive. Its Xenos dead had left only architecture and the memory of impossible craftsmanship. Yet by the time Imperial augurs fixed the planet's terminator and marked the principal breach zones, it no longer truly belonged to its makers. The corruption there had remade everything through a logic of exquisite blasphemy. The first sight of the capital broke silence on every bridge that beheld it. Sprawling across a continent of pale stone, the city shone beneath a sky the color of opal bruised by dusk. Towers rose like sculpted ivory bones, plated in living skin that rippled under the wind as though breathing. Spires curved in elegant, impossible arcs and ended in hooks from which hung choirs of flayed bodies strung by silver wires. Each mouth opened in permanent rapture, each throat tuned into a note in some colossal harmonic engine. Marble courts gleamed like polished moonlight until the first bombardment shells struck them, and blood sheeted from the fractures in dark arterial fans. Vast mirror plazas reflected not the city above them, but alternate versions of whatever warrior stood before them, each reflection grander, purer, more sovereign, more beloved, more complete than the one staring back. The place was sumptuous enough to feel sinful merely by existing. The first mortal battalions to make planetfall had to be shot where they stood, not because they broke, because they knelt. They walked from their landers into perfume-laced air and under colonnades carved with forms so elegant the human eye seemed made to ache for them, and many simply forgot what they had come for. Men removed helmets to smell the wind and sighed as though returning home after a lifetime of exile. Officers lowered swords. Troopers reached toward their own reflections in the mirror courts and wept at the beauty shown there, at the stronger, nobler, more adored selves those false surfaces offered them. Some began to cut at their own faces with combat knives, laughing through tears as they tried to carve away every feature that failed to match the perfection in the glass. The Emperor saw the reports and gave his order. No archive was to be preserved. No reliquary was to be studied. No artwork was to be seized for Terra or Mars. Every fresco, statuary vault, symphonic chamber, icon hall, museum crypt, and Xenos memory store in the corrupted zone was to be burned without cataloguing. Every living remembrancer enclave attached to the expedition, every painter, chronicler, sculptor, poet, and curator brought to witness the Crusade's greatness was to be removed from the theatre under guard, and if extraction failed, immolated alongside their work. Nothing beautiful from that place would be permitted to survive. Nothing capable of teaching yearning, refinement, or awe through corrupted form would be allowed to infect the Imperium. The command spread through the fleet, like a blade dragged slowly through silk. Lorgar heard it in the command chapel aboard his flagship and felt his stomach turn to lead. He had borne the slaughter of the tainted. He had endured the lies, the silences, the butcher's arithmetic of his father's hidden war, by telling himself necessity had become monstrous because the enemy was monstrous. But this order revealed something colder. The Emperor was not merely at war with false gods, he was at war with awe itself, with memory uplifted by beauty, with the instinct in mankind that bowed before what surpassed it. To Lorgar, listening to the decree hiss through the vox, while censers smoked around icons never officially permitted to exist, it seemed suddenly possible that his father would rather sterilize the soul of humanity than risk any part of it bending in worship elsewhere. Erebus, hood drawn low, said carefully, "He fears contamination." Lorgar turned on him with eyes bright from some inner wound. "He fears reverence." Corferan's old ruined face remained unreadable in the half-dark. "There are times when fear is wisdom." Lorgar looked back toward the hololithic image of the city, its towers gleaming like prayers made architecture, and thought, then wisdom is becoming a mausoleum. The assault began under a sky that bled music. The Emperor's children led the spear point, descending in perfect intervals through clouds shimmering with color, impossible to name cleanly in mortal tongues. Their drop craft fell like jeweled blades. Their formation timing was exact enough to seem choreographed by fate itself. When the ramps crashed down, they came out not in ragged fury like Angron's sons, nor in stoic waves like the Death Guard, but in flawless execution, every step measured, every angle of fire already beautiful before the first shot. Fulgrim walked among them with his blade drawn, and all the palace's obscene splendor seemed to orient itself around him as though it recognized a kindred appetite. Behind them came Ferrus Manus and the Iron Hands, blunt as artillery and twice as remorseless. They smashed firing platforms into position, locked down avenue mouths with heavy armor, and marked kill sectors with industrial severity that offended the place by simple existence. The pairing worked at first. Fulgrim opened the wound. Ferrus made sure it stayed open. The enemy answered with artistry. Choirs hanging from silver lattices shrieked in carefully tuned crescendos that shattered armor glass, ruptured eardrums, and caused men's hearts to skip or burst according to pitch. Harmonically charged cannonades rolled from towers plated in breathing skin, firing not shells, but waves of sensation that made mortal soldiers moan in bliss, even while their nerves blackened and peeled away from the spine. Demons emerged across mirror courts in forms impossible to look away. From bodies sleek and terrible and exquisitely wrong, all blade limbs, silken flayed musculature, jewel bright eyes, and smiles too intimate for anything born in sanity. Fulgrim met them like a prince returning to claim a throne he had never known he missed. He was magnificent. That was the danger. He cut through the first wave with a grace that mocked the very idea of effort. His blade traced silver arcs through perfume and blood haze. Heads came away in sprays too fine to resemble butcher's work, and instead looked almost ornamental until they hit the marble and burst. A demon with arms like hooked sabers lunged for him and lost both wrists, then its throat, before its body understood it had been struck. Another came singing, and he split it from sternum to pelvis, so cleanly its two halves slid apart an instant later, with the organs still shivering between them. He laughed once, not from mockery, but from exultation so pure it cut Ferrus deeper than any accusation could have, because the line had begun to blur. Each triumph made Fulgrim brighter, faster, more precise. Each kill fed not merely his momentum, but his pleasure in his own mastery. There was no crude lust in it, no surrender yet, only the terrible intoxication of being superb in a place that rewarded superbity with ecstasy. He fought like an artist, proving that murder too could be perfected. And somewhere behind his beautiful face, behind the narrowed eyes, and the controlled breath, and the delighted contempt for anything slower than himself, genuine rapture had begun to breathe. Ferrus saw it. He saw it when Fulgrim disemboweled a demon champion and paused a heartbeat too long, watching the black-red coils spill steaming over his boots. He saw it when his brother's smile lingered after cutting through a choir lattice, as flayed bodies and silver wires collapsed around him in a shrieking crimson curtain. He saw it when Fulgrim looked up at the living skinned towers with fascination rather than disgust. "Brother," Ferrus voxed across the battle cant, "remember why we are here." Fulgrim skewered a shrieking thing through one eye and twisted hard, splashing himself in narcotic black ichor. To destroy corruption. To resist it. Fulgrim's laughter crackled over the channel. "Is that not what I am doing with unparalleled success?" Ferrus's voice hardened like a vice closing. "You are enjoying yourself too much." "I enjoy excellence. You always mistook that for sin because you never had the patience to refine anything beyond endurance." The words were light, almost playful. The silence that followed them was not. Behind the spear point came the mortal hosts, and the palace devoured them. Auxiliar platoons entered the mirror courts and saw themselves enthroned, adored, sculpted from impossible nobility. Men fell to their knees. Some reached toward the glass so desperately they broke their fingers against it, then kept striking until their nails tore away and bone showed white through red pulp. Others turned on comrades who blocked their view, battering faces to jelly with rifle butts while sobbing apologies they did not mean. Choir weaponry rolled through the ranks and transformed pain into appetite. Troopers ripped off gloves to feel blood on bare skin. An officer carved the aquila into his chest with his command knife and smiled beatifically while doing it. Medici teams attempting restraint were pulled down by the very wounded they meant to save and torn apart by hands suddenly frantic to touch nerve, flesh, heat, sensation, anything, everything, more. The central horror unfolded in the court of endless reflection, a plaza broad as a hive district and paved in mirrored stone veined beneath with slow-moving blood. At its far end sat a demon court upon tiered steps of ivory that bent like vertebrae, creatures draped in living silk and chains of finger bones, their herald at the center, a towering thing of androgynous horror whose lower half was a mass of coiling musculature and whose upper body shone with polished perfection from the waist to the throat, above which its face constantly changed to match the observer's most secret idea of beauty. Fulgrim and his elite charged it. The Emperor's children hit the court like a gemstone hammer. Phoenix Guard drove long spears through demon torsos and lifted them writhing into the air. Palatine blades danced through ranks of silk-skinned horrors, severing hands, throats, and shining spinal columns in sprays that looked almost jeweled before the stink reached the nose. Fulgrim himself leapt the first tier and carved his way upward in a storm of polished murder. He gutted one courtier so elegantly its innards spilled over the stairs like a wreath of crimson ribbons. He split another from shoulder to hip and spun through the shower. Black and ruby gore painted his armor. He seemed to gleam brighter for it. Behind them, the mortal lines collapsed into ecstasy and lunacy. Whole platoons dropped weapons and began flaying themselves open in the belief that one more layer of skin removed might expose the perfect self beneath. Men pressed their faces to the bleeding marble and licked it while shells burst among them. Some screamed in pleasure when shrapnel took limbs away. Others embraced demons and were disemboweled with expressions of grateful wonder. The infection of sensation spread faster than any officer could suppress. Discipline died giggling. Horus, monitoring from the forward command terraces, saw the breakdown and gave the only order left. Purge the rear. Heavy bolter teams opened fire into the corrupted mortal mass. Autocannon rounds tore men apart in red clouds. Fulgrim's own supporting companies turned their guns on the writhing auxiliaries behind them and pulped them where they crawled, screamed, moaned, or reached for impossible bliss. Flesh burst. Brains painted the mirror floor. Limbs skipped away across the blood-slick marble. There was no time for mercy and no space for pity. Either the enthralled died, or they clogged the avenue and became more mouths for the court to feed upon. Fulgrim reached the herald as the bolter purge thundered behind him. The demon smiled with his own face. Not exactly. Better. A Fulgrim stripped of doubt, of rivalry, of need for approval, of every bruised pride had ever hidden from itself. A Fulgrim for whom perfection was not pursuit, but state. Beloved, it purred. Fulgrim struck it in fury so sudden even Ferrus, watching through the smoke, felt relief. The blade took the demon through the collar and opened half the chest. The thing only moaned in delight. It answered with claw and whip fast grace, slashing Fulgrim across the breastplate and tearing a line of blood from living tissue beneath the armor seam. Fulgrim hissed, then laughed. They circled amid dead courtiers and bolter-shattered soldiers, the palace choir rising, around them in a note so beautiful it made some men vomit blood merely to hear it. Fulgrim fought like obsession incarnate. Each exchange shaved away another sliver of restraint. Each cut he landed drew from him more ferocious pleasure. When at last he impaled the herald through the throat and out between the shoulder blades, he held it there close enough to watch the changing faces flicker and fail. For a heartbeat, he did not look triumphant. He looked hungry. Ferrus reached him a moment later, hammer and blade wet with ruin. He saw the expression before Fulgrim mastered it. He seized his brother by the shoulder and forced him to turn. "This ends now." Fulgrim shook him off with a violence sharper than either expected. "Do not lay hands on me as though I were some fevered mortal." Ferrus's iron fingers flexed, then stopped looking like one. Around them the court died. Towers burned. The mirror floor cracked and bled. Yet the words between the brothers carried a colder peril. "You think yourself immune because you are coarse," Fulgrim said, breathing hard, blood and black ichor mingling on his lips. "You think ugliness is a shield. I think clarity is. No, you think denial is strength." Ferrus stepped closer, jaw clenched hard enough to stand against artillery. "And you think desire is mastery." Neither struck the other. Not then. That would have been cleaner than what passed between them instead. The knowledge that each saw in the other a future he despised. The first edge of tragedy sharpening where love still remained. The city burned for 3 days under the Emperor's order. Archives were torched unopened. Reliquary vaults were slagged. Artworks older than human empire were reduced to black flakes under plasma bombardment. Remembrancers who had entered the theatre and lingered too long before the wrong murals or harmonics were dragged from studios and memory halls, judged contaminated, and burned with their own canvases and manuscripts. The palace of excess became a furnace of deliberate Philistinism. Every beautiful thing fed to fire because beauty itself had been made infectious. Lorgar watched pyres consume statues that might once have taught civilizations how to kneel, and felt something in him go cold with irreversible understanding. His father would burn the stars themselves if their radiance encouraged worship not meant for him. After the campaign's principal breach points were broken and the surviving enemy routed into screaming twilight corridors where curs and the lion hunted them without mercy, Horus sought the Emperor in a chamber aboard the flagship where no other sons were admitted. The room was bare save for a table of black stone, a hanging chart of stars, and the presence that made all architecture feel inadequate by comparison. The Emperor stood with one hand braced upon the table edge, looking down at the root cluster Fulgrim had uncovered, and the larger movements now converging beyond it. He did not turn when Horus entered. "You wished speech," the Emperor said. Horus stopped across from him. The War Master's face bore no outward mutiny, no theatrical defiance. That made the gravity of his words greater, not less. "I wish truth. You have more truth now than any son before this war, and less certainty." The Emperor finally looked at him. Horus met that gaze and did not look away. "We have burned loyal worlds, buried our own beneath bombardment, sealed breaches with our servants' souls, and now we destroy art, memory, and wonder because the enemy can wear them as masks." His voice tightened, though not with fear. "Tell me plainly, Father, are your sons meant to conquer this darkness, or merely to be spent against it?" The Emperor answered at once. "Both, if necessary. No adornment, no mitigation, no half-truth to soften the shape of it." Horus absorbed the words as one might absorb a blade, entering the body, not surprised by pain, only by the exact place it chose to land. For a while neither spoke. Then Horus inclined his head, not in agreement, in acknowledgement. When he left, the chamber felt colder than before. That same cycle, under seals, no ordinary commander would ever see broken. Lorgar departed with Erebus and Cor Faran. The official logs called it doctrinal compliance work and deep-root reconnaissance. The escort was too small for war and too secretive for diplomacy. Some aboard his fleet thought it treachery. Others thought panic. A few thought he had finally gone in search of the godhood he had been denied permission to name. Only Lorgar knew which was closest to the truth, and even he was no longer certain. In the command sanctum, The remaining primarchs gathered as the Emperor expanded the larger star chart beyond Fulgrim's harmonics. New route lines ignited across the dark. Old seals broke. Regions long hidden under sigil lock displayed their names. Among them, one world burned brighter than the rest, not because its star was greater, but because every path of consequence now seemed to bend toward it. Molech. Several of the primarchs frowned, searching memory for reasons the name should matter more than it did. Horus felt something colder than recognition touch the back of his mind, as though a door had been mentioned in his hearing, though he had never been told it existed. Magnus stared in silence. Dawn's features tightened at once, already measuring what any world so hidden implied. Sanguinius simply watched his father, and saw, for the first time in many campaigns, a shadow of something almost like old pain behind the Emperor's majesty. The master of mankind placed his hand upon the light of that world. "I have hidden this place from you," he said, "because some doors remain dangerous even in knowledge. That concealment is ended." The chamber did not breathe. Our war goes there now. Molech was a beautiful world by any measure that had not yet been taught suspicion. Its seas were deep cobalt beneath a pale gold sun. Its mountain chains rose clean and bright from belts of green forest and orderly settlements planned according to an older ideal of imperial grace, before necessity had taught mankind to build only in angles that could be fortified and depths that could be sealed. Even from orbit, before the fleets occluded the heavens with steel, it possessed the composure of a garden laid beneath a knife and not yet made aware of the blade. That innocence did not survive the first council held above it. The primarchs gathered in the strategium of the flagship under the light of an enlarged star sphere, and at its center burned the world their father had hidden from them since the dawn of the Great Crusade. Around it ran layers of seals, route denials, cipher masks, erased histories, and dead records restored only because the Emperor himself willed them visible. It was not merely a world concealed from hostile powers. It had been concealed from suns, armies, administrations, the Mechanicum, the Council of Terra, perhaps from all but Malcador and the Emperor alone. Horus looked at the layers of concealment and felt something inside him finally go still. Not calm, not acceptance, the last movement of trust dying. "You knew," he said. No one pretended not to hear the accusation in it. The room had progressed beyond such theatre. The Emperor stood before the star sphere with one hand behind his back and the other resting near the image of Molech, though not upon it, as if even now he acknowledged the world as something more than geography. "I knew," he said. Horus took a step forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "You knew what waited behind the veil. You knew the powers stalking us. You knew there were doors into the deeper immaterium that fleets could not force by mere tonnage and courage. And while we bled through ignorance, while worlds burned and legions died blind, you kept the road hidden." The Emperor's gaze did not waver. "I kept it hidden because knowledge of it is in itself a contagion. Some truths do not arm merely by being spoken. They invite." That answer cost us sons. Yes. It was the calmness of it that made several of the primarchs tense, not because they had expected apology, but because they had hoped some fragment of regret might still be found in him when speaking of such losses. There was power in the Emperor's certainty. There was also cruelty beyond any weapon. Magnus's lone eye narrowed. Fulgrim folded his arms. Mortarion looked away in open disgust. Russ simply stared with the expression of a hunter, finding the tracks of a beast he had always suspected was larger than claimed. Horus laughed once under his breath, and the sound held nothing of humor. "You sent us to war blind, while keeping a gate to the enemy's heart beneath your cloak." "I sent you to war alive," said the Emperor. "Had the knowledge spread earlier, some of you would already be lost. Then perhaps Horus said. "You should have trusted your sons to choose not to be. Trust is not the same thing as leaving blades within reach of a child." The room chilled. Horus's expression altered by no visible motion, yet every son present felt the strike land. For one murderous instant, it seemed possible that whatever remained of obedience between father and favorite might shatter there in the strategium and never be repaired. Sanguinius stepped into the silence before it curdled further. "What is Molech?" he asked, voice grave, in the plainest possible truth. The Emperor looked at him, and some infinitesimal softening crossed the light in his eyes. Perhaps it was only the memory of earlier hopes. Perhaps Sanguinius alone still possessed the gift of drawing from him something not entirely made of iron. "A gate," the Emperor said. "Not of masonry or machine. A wound. An aperture cut between reality and the deeper strata of the warp. It cannot be opened by fleets alone. It must be stabilized by will, sacrifice, and the correct harmonics of mind and matter. There are others. This is the greatest under human reach." No one spoke for several moments after that. The idea itself had weight. Then Dawn did what Dawn always did, when revelation ceased to matter and consequences began. "If we go through it," he said, "then every enemy beyond it will answer in kind. Terra must be prepared for retaliation before the first threshold is breached." The Emperor inclined his head. "You understand." Dawn did not look pleased at being understood. "You will return to Terra," the Emperor said. "Begin fortification in absolute depth. I want orbital denial grids thick enough to blind suns. I want the palace remade as a fortress fit to resist all things we have yet seen, and worse besides. Seal the approaches to the dungeon, increase the blank reserves, accelerate work on the Webway project. Nothing is to be left to peacetime tolerances again." For the first time in the campaign, a primarch looked truly reluctant to leave the main war, not from pride, but from the knowledge that his father had just admitted even victory at Molech might not prevent annihilation. Dawn bowed his head once. "It will be done." He left within the hour. His fleets broke from the swelling concentration around Molech and turned sunward, carrying with them engineers, bastion plans, siege ordnance, defense satellites, whole workforces uprooted from compliant sectors, and enough void steel to begin remaking Terra into a mausoleum that could shoot back. Those who watched his departure from the command decks did so in silence. It felt less like a redeployment than the first tolling bell of a future no one yet wished to name. Behind him, the largest military concentration in human history gathered. Around Molech, Guilliman directed the mass flow of supply with the austere intensity of a man wrestling an ocean into formation. 500 worlds were not merely rerouted now, but stripped. Grain, promethium, labor, shell stock, reactor fuel, replacement hulls, gene seed stores, Medici inventory, machine components, Titan plasma coils, sacrificial livestock, burial cloth, water casks, trench sheeting, atmospheric processors, star-fort ballast, all of it flowed toward Molech in chains so vast that astropaths comparing route traffic to earlier campaign records believed at first that whole sectors had vanished from the Imperium. In a sense, they had. Entire systems were left nearly bare in order to feed the operation assembling around the hidden world. Perturabo converted the orbital space into tiers of siege coherence. Arc fleets were anchored in shell patterns around the principal assault lanes. Titan legions came under tow from forge worlds already bruised by overproduction. Their god engines housed in continent-sized landers and worshipped by priesthoods too exhausted to distinguish reverence from delirium. The Lion enforced route secrecy and counter-infiltration with pitiless efficiency, destroying stray vessels that approached the Molech perimeter without proper cipher. No warning, no inspection, no possibility of contamination. The Emperor did not disguise the cost. Psychers arrived in chains, hundreds of thousands of them. Not the trained and stable alone, though those were taken first, but black ships disgorged every category of sanctioned human soul that could be made to resonate with the gate mechanisms hidden beneath Molech's surface. The weak, the fearful, the brilliant, the damaged. Some wept, some prayed, some had long since gone mad and sang to things no one else could hear. They were moved beneath armed escort into containment basilicas built around the hidden threshold, and they're set within psychic arrays so vast they resembled cathedrals erected for the sole purpose of burning minds in measured sequence. Millions of soldiers were committed to sacrificial bridgeheads before the gate even opened. They dug trenchworks around the principal continental sink, where the old Xenos or pre-human machinery of Molech slept beneath layers of sealed stone. They emplaced guns in belts so deep that from high orbit the Earth looked ringed in iron saws. They held static lines against cult insurgencies and warp pressure buildups that began before the threshold had fully stirred. Entire populations in adjacent regions were relocated, not according to pleading or innocence, but by strategic utility. Those whose labor might assist were moved under guard. Those whose settlements risked contamination were abandoned beyond the quarantine. Governors who protested were removed, some by arrest, some by execution. Molech ceased to be a world and became a function. Horus watched it all and understood too clearly. His father had moved beyond spending armies. He was spending humanity by category. When the gate opened, all previous wars became rehearsal. The hidden threshold lay beneath a mountain range whose peaks had been cored and bound in adamantine collars by long-dead hands. At its heart stood a black portal, tall as a hive spire and older than any architecture of man, a circle not cut from stone, but from negation, from the disciplined absence of ordinary reality. Around it, the Emperor had raised concentric arrays of null pylons, hexagrammic bastions, choir towers, and machine shrines linked by channels down which Psyker blood ran like sacrificial water. He stood before it in gold and lightning, while the choirs screamed. Magnus felt the scale of the strain and went pale despite himself. Even he had not imagined this depth. The Thousand Suns manned secondary lattice points and fed controlled pressure into the stabilization rings, their minds disciplined to the edge of rupture. Malcador oversaw the primary relay chain, face drawn thin as old parchment, staff shaking in one hand only when he forgot for a moment to hold still. "Now," the Emperor said. The first wave of Psykers burned. Their deaths did not merely power the mechanism. They were the mechanism. Souls stripped from flesh in ordered sequence, reduced to force, hammered into the aperture until the circle shuddered and widened, and the darkness within it looked suddenly not like emptiness, but like a depth in which stars drowned. Reality buckled. The gate opened. Every man within 50 kilometers felt it in his bones. Some vomited. Some fell to their knees. A few simply died where they stood, as their hearts refused the knowledge of what had come near. Beyond the threshold lay no single landscape. It was not a tunnel. It was access. A way into war made of impossible routes. Whole horizons flashed within the black circle in succession and overlap. Fortresses grown from hatred like tumors in a dark sky. Fields of chained stars. Mountains built from teeth and scripture and rust. Deserts where time lagged behind footsteps. Oceans that were not water, but memory, liquefied into treachery. The assault went through anyway. The first bridgeheads vanished. Millions of soldiers crossed into those shifting battlefields and were lost almost at once to realities that did not respect sequence or distance. Vox records returned before the transmissions had been sent. Casualty reports arrived for men who had not yet marched. In one region, the dead clawed out of shell holes and resumed firing with half their faces gone because hatred, once spent, was being recycled into motion. In another, fortifications grew overnight from fear, their bastions extruding from the ground in shapes resembling every besieger's private nightmare made architectural. Tanks rolled forward and aged to rust around their crews. Titan steps fell a second before the god engines lifted their feet. Time itself convulsed, doubled back, and bit. The primarchs entered that apocalypse, and the gods answered each according to his secret wound. Angron found no single battle, only all battles. Endless slaughter spread in every direction without culmination, without the mercy of victory or defeat. Only one more enemy beyond the next mound of skulls, one more roar, one more chance to split flesh and feel the nails sing approval through the agony. The realm wanted him not merely furious, but content in fury, at home in it, relieved to stop pretending he had ever been made for anything but this. He hacked through red hosts and brass towers, cursing the Emperor with every blow, because each order obeyed proved afresh that his father's only gift had been a larger arena in which to die killing. Magnus crossed into libraries without walls, where every page was a possible history and every unread sentence a weapon. Infinite knowledge spread before him in layered geometries that promised the final pattern, the answer behind every prohibition, the full shape of the powers manipulating mankind and the secret of mastering them. He walked among those revelations with his eye blazing, at times advancing by sheer discipline, at times nearly halting in awe, dangerous enough to be a form of surrender. The god opposing him did not tempt with pleasure or rage, it tempted with vindication. Fulgrim met perfection refined beyond anything the palace of excess had shown him. Forms moved there that made all sculpture seem crude, every motion of combat a sonata, every kill an elegant theorem in blood. He fought among mirror-bright demons and living symphonies, magnificent and appalled by how naturally his hand matched their cadence. Ferrus remained near him through much of it, iron certainty dragging him back from the edge again and again, though each rescue cost them fresh bitterness. Mortarion walked through kingdoms of endurance, where nothing died quickly, and everything insisted on continuing. Mountains breathed through, clogged lungs. Armies advanced as rotting processions, whose flesh sloughed from the bone without diminishing their resolve. The temptation offered to him was not joy and decay, but mastery over suffering, the promise that pain could be made eternal and therefore rendered powerless. He hated it with all the force of Barbarus in his blood. That hatred was the only clean thing left to him. Curs moved through a wasteland where every shadow already knew its ending. Visions stalked him there not as abstract prophecies, but as certainty embodied. He saw himself flaying worlds and being thanked for it. He saw his brothers dead, betrayed, exalted, forgotten. He saw the Imperium become exactly the empire of fear he had always believed it to be beneath the gold. The realm offered him the sweetest poison of all, being proven right. Lorgar should not have been there, yet the Gate War was not bound by marching orders alone. In one impossible convergence, amid a battlefield of collapsed temples and giant statues half-grown from prayer, Horus glimpsed him in the distance with Erebus and Cor Pharon, the secretive departure from earlier campaigns now resolving itself into this pilgrimage of dread. Lorgar knelt amid broken altars, while demonic mouths spoke from every direction in tones of adoration. Devotion itself assailed him, not false worship from beneath, but the terrible certainty that meaning required surrender, that to bow was not weakness, but completion. Whether he resisted or simply delayed his answer, Horus could not tell. The image vanished under shellfire and impossible light before certainty formed. And Horus came at last to the vision meant for him. It took the form of empire, not the Imperium as it was, blood-crusted and expedient, but the Imperium as it might have become under a different hand. Cities lit without fear, conquered worlds governed without silence, legions honored as sons rather than tools, a father who trusted rather than manipulated. Then the vision shifted, and the father was gone, and in his place stood Horus himself, upon a throne not of decay, but of earned dominion, beloved, obeyed, triumphant, the one who had taken the burden and carried it better. It was the cruelest temptation, because so much of it contained truths he had already begun to think in secret. He broke the vision only by refusing to look at what it said of his father. Sanguinius remained the moral heart of the war, because he continued to fight as though nobility still mattered in a realm built to mock the idea. He hauled mortal survivors from collapsing impossible trenches, even when doing so endangered the wider advance. He gave mercy killings to the maimed with his own hand when lesser commanders would have left them for numbers. He refused the whispered invitations in blood and beauty alike. On battlefields where the dead rose cursing and the stars seemed to pulse like infected organs, he still chose grace. That choice did not cleanse the war. It made its filth easier to see. The Emperor drove onward through it all. He did not merely fight the deeper warp, he navigated it with the assurance of one who had known its roads before any of his sons were born. At the climax of the Molech campaign, when the assault lines finally reached the innermost convergence where all the hostile realms knotted around one another in murderous pressure, Horus saw why. The Emperor stood upon a bastion of white fire raised over a plain of writhing unreality. Around him, demons of all dominions hurled themselves forward in tides vast enough to drown worlds. Choir towers burned. Titan engines collapsed into molten ruin. Primarchs fought like legends at the edge of extinction. And at the center of it, the Emperor drew upon power that was not merely his own native majesty. He reached into the wound beneath the war and took fire from it. Not worship, not surrender, appropriation. The energies he wielded bore the taste of the old bargain at Molech, whatever it had been in ages past. He had not bent the knee to the gods. That truth remained. Yet he had taken from their realm once, long ago, and carried that stolen infernal radiance within himself ever since, hidden beneath the rhetoric of reason and conquest. Horus saw it in the way the Emperor's aura deepened from gold to something older and harsher, in the way reality recoiled from his hand as though recognizing a thief of heaven's arsenals. Whole legions of demons vanished when he unleashed it. Fortresses made of hate collapsed inward. Time's snarls straightened under the pressure of his will. Horus stared through blood mist and shell smoke and felt the last unbroken idol in him crack. His father had always stood nearer to godhood than he admitted, not metaphorically, not by the adoration of men, truly, and he had concealed that, as he concealed all things, deciding alone what truths his sons were fit to bear. When the convergence finally buckled, and the primarchs, regrouped amid the ruin of 10 impossible battlefields half overlaid on one another, it became clear that even this magnitude of assault had not accomplished the simple fantasy of annihilation. The powers beyond the veil could be driven back, starved, mauled, denied favorable ground, sealed out, wounded in their manifestations, but not slain outright by armies, not even armies led by the Emperor and his sons through a gate into their own abyss. Magnus voiced it first, bitter and exhausted, one hand clamped over a wound that bled light rather than blood. They are not fortresses to be stormed and emptied. They are conditions, hungers. We can unseat their footholds, not end what gives them birth. The Emperor did not disagree. That frightened Horus more than argument would have. The final choice lay before them then, not as rhetoric, but as strategy. The gods could not be killed, only bound back, denied, starved for a time. The gate at Molech could be used to strike them hard, enough to shatter this present offensive, perhaps break the immediate designs laid upon the primarchs, perhaps buy the Imperium years or decades in which the next betrayal might take another shape. But the price would be paid in sons, in legions, in human oceans of life, and in what kind of empire could survive after learning this was the cost of survival. Horus looked from the Emperor to Sanguinius, from the blood-winged angel still trying to remain noble in hell, to the father who would spend any nobility in Tyre if it bought one more hour of dominion, and he understood that whatever came after Molech, whether history named it victory or merely delay, the future shape of the Imperium had already been chosen. It would live, but it would live as something that had looked into hell, taken lessons from it, and decided endurance mattered more than innocence ever again. Catastrophe ceased to possess sequence. It happened everywhere at once, until the Imperium's scribes, tacticians, and remembrancers alike would later fail to say where the ending of the war truly began. Some claimed it was at Molech, where the gate yawned wider than any human will should ever have permitted, and the final convergence of the warp powers pressed against reality with enough force to make continents shudder. Others swore the true breaking point came in the void, when thousands of warships fought above the hidden world in such density that augur returns resembled solid metal continents grinding through one another amid fire. Still others would have pointed to the rear echelon worlds, the bastion systems and supply nodes and wounded fleet anchorages, where demonic incursions burst open behind the main line like ulcers in the flesh of empire. On Terra, Rogal Dawn received casualty streams and warp instability forecasts so vast in scale that he began fortifying the throne world not as a capital expecting war, but as a tomb expecting resurrection. The galaxy had become a single wound. Above Molech, the void was a furnace of annihilation. Arc fleets burned beside grand cruisers and line battleships, their broken hulls vomiting atmosphere, burning bodies, and streams of escape craft that seldom escaped anything. Warp entities manifested inside shattered decks, where Geller field fluctuations aligned with psychic overload. Whole lance batteries were turned inward by machine spirits driven mad with ecstatic terror. Boarding actions raged through cathedral corridors, slick with blood and hydraulic fluid, while outside, Nova cannon fire erased squadrons so completely that nothing remained but expanding light and a rain of molten fragments. The Emperor's fleets held because Guilliman had made holding a science, because the Lion had made secrecy a blade, because Perturabo had layered the orbital geometry in overlapping shells of punishment, and because Horus stood at the center of the command lattice like a war made articulate. He held the center as lesser beings held a sword. His orders moved from flagship to flagship with brutal precision. Reserve squadrons were committed at the exact second collapsing lines still retained enough mass to become useful again. Damaged carriers were sacrificed to seal approach vectors rather than preserved for sentiment. Astropathic misdirection fed whole enemy manifestations into prepared kill boxes, where lance arrays scissored them into raw warp fire. Horus did not look exhausted. That was part of his terror. He had reached the stage of command where fatigue passed beyond the flesh and became simply another fact denied by necessity. "Seal the southern rupture with hulls if guns fail," he ordered one blood-choked hour, as the outer screens dissolved beneath a surge of horned forms the size of cruisers. "No vessel withdraws unless I command it. If the breach takes the lane, Terra sees what comes after." Abaddon, black with ash and deck gore beside him, gave the acknowledgement and turned to relay it without hesitation, though both knew it meant thousands more would die in ships converted into barricades for a few minutes of survival. On Terra, those minutes mattered. Dawn had returned to the throne world and found preparation itself too slow an art for what approached. He remade the orbital plates. He buried whole mountains in weapon silos. He converted ceremonial avenues into fire corridors and cathedral districts into bastion mazes. Beneath the palace, he sealed the approaches to the nascent webway works with such layered brutality that even custodians began to whisper among themselves about the scale of his foresight. His genius shone coldest when the first splinters of the final backlash reached Sol. They came not as fleets, but as rents. Warp stress tore open at the edge of the system and flung nightmare debris into real space. Derelict ships crewed by dead men who still loaded their guns, screaming storms made of faces, and demon packs hurled outward from failed rear world. Quarantines. Dawn turned doomed ground into surviving ground by refusing every instinct except function. Orbital stations were scuttled into impact lanes to blunt the momentum of possessed hulks. Civilian traffic platforms were evacuated and mined before their populations had finished disembarking, because he would not permit a second breach to use Terran orbit as a bridgehead. Tens of millions died in the cold mathematics of that defense, and yet, by Dawn's hand, Terra endured the first shock intact. At Molech, endurance had become too small a word. The Emperor led the final assault in person. No one who saw him at the heart of that last advance would ever again think of him merely as sovereign, architect, conqueror, or distant father. Those had been lesser masks, worn for an age in which mankind still required gentler lies. In the final war through Molech, he strode as Wrath incarnate, a war god in truth, if not by worship, and everything around him became smaller by comparison. Golden armor shone through layers of blood, ash, and psychic flame so bright it ceased to resemble metal and became instead a moving icon of execution. His sword burned white enough to erase color. The very ground beneath his step rebelled against ordinary matter, turning to vitrified plains, then to dust, then to nothing at all as he passed. Demon hosts did not break against him in ranks or cohorts. They vanished. Entire legions of immaterial horror struck toward his spear point and were unmade in sheets of white psychic fire that rolled across landscapes and left only smoking silhouettes where fortresses of flesh and brass had stood a heartbeat before. He raised one hand, and a mountain grown from skulls and prayers burst apart from within, its interior turning incandescent as trapped warp energies detonated in a sun-bright wound. He spoke a word no mortal tongue could remember afterward, and the plain before him became a field of upright dead, every demon pinned in place by invisible force before being annihilated one after another in crackling halos of light. Even the primarchs seemed small beside that magnitude. They shone nonetheless. Horus held the center, not because he was the strongest, but because he remained the axis around which impossible war could still become command. He moved reserve spearheads through fractures in time and terrain, held the main lines coherent when space itself tried to fold them apart, and met enemy champions with Worldbreaker in hands that had ceased to tremble at anything. He killed like a king forced to admit that kingship was a bloodier trade than any throne room ever confessed. Sanguinius fought above and through winged nightmares in skies that were not skies, but layers of screaming atmosphere, collapsing architecture, and airborne carrion storms. Vast demon shapes with feathered pinions and razored talons threw themselves at him from blood-red cloud banks, only to die on his spear, his sword, his bare hands. He tore one abomination's head away with such force the spine came out in a shining length behind it. He drove another from the air and landed atop it in a ruin of white feathers and black arterial spray, then hacked through the still convulsing body until nothing of it remained but twitching limbs and a crater full of stinking gore. Every kill fed the floor, and every heartbeat he denied it made him more terrible to behold. Russ became the beast he had always threatened to become. No strategy guided him then beyond the clean instinct of the hunter in the kill frenzy. He and his wolves crashed through breach lines where no sane commander would have spent elite strength, and somehow their sheer predatory violence achieved what measured method had not. Russ ripped a horn-crowned giant down by the throat and bit through its face guard with his own teeth before carving out the thing beneath. He howled challenges into storm fronts, and storms answered him with lightning and blood. Men who saw him at the edge of their lines later swore that for a few moments he seemed less like a primarch and more like the old death that prowled before civilization learned to build fires against it. Far away, and yet within the same impossible war, Magnus bled sorcery into reality by the continent. The battle had passed all point where restraint could preserve itself untouched. He stood within spirals of burning runes and anchored corridors through time convulsion with his own pain, sacrificing certainty, blood, and perhaps pieces of his future mind to hold the warp from simply folding imperial armies into decorative ruin. At times, he looked triumphant. At times, he looked like a martyr. No one had granted permission to die. His legion dwindled around him, blinded, charred, or driven to the edge of madness by the scale of the workings. Yet still they held formation, because without them, whole fronts would have ceased to possess sequence and become merely slaughter occurring in every direction. At once, Perturabo broke hellish fortresses with the cold fury of a genius sickened by the proof of his own necessity. He fed Titan legions, mass artillery, mechanized assaults, and mortal siege hosts into impossible geometry and made progress where anything less pitiless would have stalled forever. Hate grown into battlement, fear made masonry, flesh towers screaming through gun slits. None of it mattered to him once he had measured the stress points. He brought down one vast citadel of living iron by overloading its own shrieking heartworks with captured demon engines and the corpses of 2 full mechanized divisions packed into the breach as explosive ballast. When the fortress split, rivers of blood and boiling souls poured from it like spilled fuel. Perturabo did not look away. He merely ordered the next range correction. Angron drowned battlefields in arterial ruin until the ground ceased to be ground and became instead a red-black marsh of opened bodies, severed limbs, broken teeth, and spent casings held together by the glue of blood and ash. He was beyond even hatred by then. He existed as momentum, as accusation made of axes and roaring. The more the warp offered him endless slaughter as reward, the more savagely he denied it satisfaction by turning every kill into an insult hurled at the father who had pointed him there. He killed demons, cult lords, loyal men in his path, malformed titans, and once an entire trench line by hurling a crippled engine into it. The nails sang. He answered by making the song a scream, and in the midst of all that monstrous splendor, Lorgar broke, not through clean seduction, not by some easy embrace of dark gods, whispering that at last they understood him. His ruin was crueler. He reached the point where all masks fell away and saw too much. He saw the warp powers demanding worship through sensation, blood, plague, prophecy, and annihilation. He saw the Emperor denying divinity with his lips while inflicting godlike suffering on a scale no mortal theology could contain. He saw psyker hosts burned as candles, worlds sacrificed as arguments, suns offered up as blades and shields and fuel. He saw that both sides of the cosmic war required devotion measured in bodies, and that denial did not sanctify the suffering any more than prayer did. In a valley floored with cracked idols and burning scripture, Lorgar fell to his knees. Erebus tried to raise him. Corphiron spoke words the younger son no longer heard. Around them battle raged through altars, trenches, and impossible weather. Lorgar's face had gone hollow, his eyes bright with a grief so profound it resembled revelation. "There is no clean god," he whispered. A demon voice hissed from a shattered shrine. "Then choose the truest." Lorgar looked toward the distant brilliance of the Emperor, annihilating hosts in white fire, and toward the nearer darkness of entities fattened on worship and torment alike, and the sound that left him then was not a prayer, but the beginning of a spiritual fracture from which no future age could hope to remain uncut. While the primarchs fought at the front of Apocalypse, Malcador secured victory in the shadows by committing a secondary atrocity that would never be sung in any authorized chronicle. From sealed command vaults on Terra and relay crypts hidden in the rear anchorage, he oversaw the purges. Memory archives were opened and burned. Remembrancer orders were dissolved in blood. Astropathic witnesses whose minds contained too much unfiltered truth about Molech were quietly executed, their deaths logged as psychic overload or operational necessity. Entire command staffs on rear worlds were shot after transmitting uncensored accounts of the Gate War. Libraria, picked repositories, battlefield recordings, recovered Xenos reliquaries, and private journals were stacked in void-shielded furnaces and reduced to black flakes by order of the Sigillite. Whole populations in certain logistics hubs, having seen demonic manifestations too openly, were subjected to selective purges masked as plague quarantine. Not because Malcador relished it, because the Emperor had decreed that humanity must never understand the full scale and nature of what had been done in its name. Ignorance became an instrument of species preservation. Malcador wielded it with hands that shook only when no one could see. The decisive act of victory came when the gate reached saturation. The gods were pressing hardest then, their manifestations closest to coherence, their claim upon the primarchs, and the war itself nearest to ripening. Reality at Molech had become a layered scream. Rear echelon worlds were falling open under sympathetic ruptures. Fleet screens died by the thousand. Terra's warnings multiplied. The final choice that chapter after chapter had stalked now stood bare. Either the Emperor would force the convergence shut through means so cruel they would poison the Imperium forever, or the Gate War would become permanent and the galaxy would slowly drown in the consequences. He chose cruelty. The Psyker hosts were sacrificed in full, not by battalion, not by relay chain, in full. The black basilicas beneath Molech's mountains blazed with soul death as every chained psyker in the stabilization arrays was ignited together in a single act of psychic consumption so vast it knocked lesser men dead at orbital range. Their burning minds became a tidal force. The Emperor seized that force and drove it through the gate like a white spear into the heart of the convergence. Whole sectors already compromised by warp seepage were marked for quarantine fire, and the fleets obeyed the order with the numb obedience of men who no longer believed disobedience would preserve anything worth saving. Cyclonic saturation, stellar bombardment, virus release, plasma scouring. Worlds still containing loyal formations, wounded fleets, civilians, and labor populations vanished under sanctioned annihilation because the contagion of the gate might otherwise have used them as a second road. Even on the primary front, the Emperor did not call back every soldier. Uncounted loyal formations were left fighting within the breach, while the closure sequences began. Some were too deep to retrieve. Some were judged strategically irrelevant compared with timing. Some, perhaps, were simply spent already in the cold equation he alone believed he could solve. Horus saw reserve lines still engaged when the first closure light rolled outward. Sanguinius saw blood angels below him, still cutting upward toward extraction corridors that no longer existed. Vulcan saw mortal battalions on the ridge lines wave signal flares in desperate vain hope as the white fire advanced over them. Magnus felt the gate crush men into unreality while their souls screamed past his mind in fragments. None of it altered the Emperor's will. He forced the gods back. The closing of Molech was not a door shutting, it was a mutilation. The converged realms howled as if disemboweled. Demonic armies were ripped backward through collapsing geometries, torn apart by starvation of contact and denial of sequence. Brass fortresses cracked, plague kingdoms blistered, mirror courts shattered into blind dust. Libraries of lies burned from both ends at once. The powers beyond the veil were not slain. That remained impossible, but their moment of greatest manifestation was broken, their clean claim upon the primarchs denied, their feast interrupted by a hand ruthless enough to throw whole civilizations into the fire to spoil the meal. They retreated laughing. That was the last insult, and perhaps the truest. For though the gods were hurled back howling into their own abyss, they departed with the satisfaction of knowing the Imperium that survived them had already been altered in their image. Harder, crueler, more secretive, more willing to burn memory, beauty, innocence, and truth for the sake of endurance. The species had survived because the Emperor took war into Hell. Hell's answer had been to teach mankind which of its methods worked. When the light finally guttered and the gate sealed beneath layers of fresh ruin, the Emperor stood victorious amid a wasteland no sane empire would have called triumph. He was diminished. The victory had cost him more than armies. The old theft at Molech, the appropriation of fire won long ago, the burden of forcing closure upon a war no mortal framework should have contained, all of it had taken some irretrievable toll. He still shone brighter than suns. He still made primarchs seem like lesser statues around a living god. Yet those nearest him felt the difference. A new remoteness had entered him, not of temperament alone, but of necessity. Seals, throne work, and constant hidden labors would claim him far earlier than planned. The Great Crusade, as once imagined, could not truly resume. The Emperor had won by becoming more terrible and more absent than before. One by one, his sons came before him after the silence. Horus approached last among the foremost. The field around the sealed ruin was carpeted with ashes, fused armor, broken standards, and the remains of forms no archivist would ever be permitted to name. He walked through it all with blood-blackened plate and the stillness of a man who had seen enough truth to become dangerous to those who required faith. When he reached his father, he knelt. The gesture was perfect. The loyalty inside it was not. The Emperor laid a hand upon his shoulder for the briefest moment, a benediction, an acknowledgement, perhaps even the tattered memory of affection. Horus bowed his head lower, and all who saw him might have believed the bond restored by victory. Only Horus knew that something essential had not risen again when he knelt. Obedience remained. Love, perhaps in some wounded form, remained. Uncomplicated trust was dead. Sanguinius came, away sorrowing. He had remained noble in the pit, and learned that nobility did not save men from being spent. His wings were ragged with blood, soot, and missing feathers. His face looked older, not by years, but by grief. He still loved his father. That made the sorrow harsher. Vulcan left sickened beyond words. He had watched too many loyal dead offered up as useful loss. The mercy in him had not died. That was why the war had injured him more deeply than brothers built of colder metals. Magnus left resentful and vindicated both, the most dangerous combination of all. He had been proven necessary, distrusted, magnificent, and correct in too many of his accusations. He had also seen the Emperor wield powers stolen from the same abyss for which Magnus himself was eternally rebuked. Such contradictions do not vanish, they ferment. Angron left raging, because rage was the only language left to him after being used as both spear and bait in a war that had vindicated every hatred he ever held against the father who made him. Kerr's left vindicated. That was perhaps the darkest outcome of all. He had looked upon the Imperium's hidden methods, its terror, its secrecy, its willingness to flay truth from history and skin worlds for peace, and found his bleakest instincts confirmed. He smiled more after Molech, not because he was pleased, but because he no longer needed prophecy to know what the empire beneath the gold truly was. Lorgar left spiritually broken. He did not proclaim new faith or open betrayal. The fracture in him had passed beyond slogans. He had lost the last possibility of simple belief and gained in its place a wound that would seek meaning with the desperation of a drowning man clawing for shore. Such men do not remain still. They become apostles of whatever answers them first. Behind all of them, the Imperium moved at once to bury the war. Malcador's censors spread like ash. Witnesses vanished. Histories were reauthored. The burned worlds were listed under plague interdiction, navigational catastrophe, hostile Xenos action, or sealed strategic necessity. Molech itself became a wound over which official language poured concrete by the continent. Veterans were dispersed, isolated, mind-scrubbed where possible, killed where required. Humanity would survive without understanding what had purchased survival. That ignorance would become one more pillar of the age to come. On Terra, the fortifications remained. Dawn did not tear them down, because some part of him knew the war had not ended so much as changed state. The Webway project deepened beneath the palace. Blank reserves increased. Orbital rings multiplied. The throne world braced like a man expecting the second blow after the first has shattered all the obvious bones. In the years that followed, scholars might argue whether the heresy as history remembered it had been prevented, delayed, transformed, or simply scattered into darker tributaries. They would argue in ignorance, because the truest version had already been burned. Perhaps the War Master did not fall in the old way. Perhaps betrayal took new roads. Perhaps the gods, denied their clean harvest at Molech, learned patience and chose subtler knives. None of that altered the final truth. Mankind survived. It survived because the Emperor of mankind carried war into hell before hell could fully claim his sons. It survived because he was willing to spend worlds, armies, psychers, memory, innocence, and truth to deny the gods a single decisive feast. It survived because the primarchs shone like bloody constellations across battlefields no human eye should have witnessed. It survived because Malcador strangled history in its cradle. It survived because brothers obeyed after learning too much. And as the last hidden archives burned and the fleets limped from the ruin of Molech under a sky made clean only by annihilation, the Imperium entered its next age, already changed beyond recall. The Emperor had taken war into hell. Hell, in return, had taught the Imperium how to resemble it.